Good morning and welcome to the fifth meeting of 2026 in Session 6 of the Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee. We have no apologies this morning. Our only public agenda item this morning is continuation of taking evidence on our inquiry into neurodivergence in Scotland. The inquiry was precipitated by the Scottish Government's decision in 2024 to delay the introduction of a Learning Disabilities, Autism and Neurodivergence Bill. In this inquiry, we will be focusing on the experience of neurodivergent people in education, employment and the criminal justice system. We will hear this morning from two roundtables, the first with a focus on the criminal justice system, the second from groups representing the interests of people with neurodivergences. We begin with our first roundtable, and before we move on to questions, I'd invite everyone to introduce themselves. I'll begin and then I'll move round to my right. I'm Karen Adam, MSP, convener of the committee.
Thanks, Karen. Good morning, everyone. I'm Maggie Chapman. I'm the Scottish Green MSP on this committee, and I'm also the deputy convener of this committee. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm John Good. I'm a member of the Law Society of Scotland Criminal Law Committee, and I'm principally a defence lawyer. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Pam Gossel. I'm a member of the Scottish Parliament for the West Region. I'm from the Conservative Party. I'm also a member of this committee.
Good morning, I'm May Dunsmuir. I'm the Chamber President of the Health and Education Chamber, which sits in the First Tier Tribunal for Scotland.
Good morning, Chair, committee members. Sarah Angus, Director of Policy, Scottish Prison Service.
Good morning, Marie McNair, MSP, representing the Clybank and Mulgai constituency. Welcome and thanks for your time this morning.
Good morning, Chair and committee members. My name is Inga Heyman. I'm an Associate Professor in Policing and Public Health at Edinburgh Napier University.
Good morning, Tess White, member of this committee from the Scottish Conservatives North East region. Thank you.
Good morning, I'm Laura Buchan. I'm a Legal Director with the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service and one of their equality leads.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Paul McLennan. I'm the MSP for East Lothian.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Superintendent Graham Galley. I am the Partnerships and Preventions Lead for Ayrshire and Arran, but I'm also the National Delivery Lead for our Neurodiversity Strategic Working Group.
Good morning, I'm Rhoda Grant. I'm Labour MSP for the Highlands and Islands.
Thank you. And now we'll go online to Natasha, who's joining us all the way from Toronto. I wonder if you have more sunshine there than we do have here, Natasha. If you'd like to introduce yourself, please.
Good morning, everyone. No, it's still very dark here. I'm Natasha Spaziani. I'm a scientist at the Centre for Addictions and Mental Health Research Hospital in Toronto, Associate Professor at the University of Toronto and Visiting Associate Professor at Edinburgh Napier University.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. I know it's quite unsociable hours for yourself, but really important that you're here. Thank you for that. So thank you, everyone. You're very welcome to join us this morning. I'm going to kick off with the first question, and if you would like to come in and answer, please just indicate with a raise of the hand, or Natasha, I think, put an R in the chat. So, given the increasing recognition of neurodivergence in Scotland and long waiting lists for autism and ADHD assessments, could you set the scene by explaining how your service interacts with neurodivergent people and whether you have seen a change in prevalence in recent years? Somebody like to come in on that one? Yeah.
I'll start. I think in terms of prevalence, we recently updated our education strategy, and as part of that we commissioned research, both literature reviews and also user voice, looking at how we could explicitly introduce neurodivergence embedded into the strategy. I think what we find within the prison service there are people with lots of different neurodivergent traits, autism, speech and language needs, alongside things such as having experienced brain injury. So whether that's an increase or not, I think what we are is much more aware of that and much more aware of how we can start to embed our practice to actually support those traits.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Sarah in terms of it's difficult. I think one of the issues we identified when we were discussing the bill was that data point about how we can quantify in terms of the prevalence and the people that we're coming into contact with. I think there has been over the last few years an awareness about the increase or the prevalence of neurodivergent people across the whole system, including within our organisations, ranging from accused to witnesses to victims. As part of the Victims and Witness Scotland Act 2014, there's a duty about communications. I think the point Sarah makes is important in relation to speech and language and understanding, about ensuring that every person has a right to be understood and to understand. So in general, we take it from that level in terms of any dealings we have with victims, witnesses and accused. But we also now have training which goes out to all our staff in terms of autism awareness, which has received really good feedback, again, in terms of a better understanding. We know that there's various steps. It's not all about training and guidance. It's about a cultural shift within organisations. But that's part of that step in relation to the people that we come into contact with on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I think, Police Scotland recognises that individuals are at the heart of everything that we do, and that needs-based approach, that trauma-informed approach is the way we've always approached things. I think as we realised we're on a journey in terms of neurodivergence, and that's why we established the Neurodiversity Strategic Working Group just over 2 years ago to coordinate our approach to that. And that was our approach to our people within the organisation, but also the communities of which we serve. As I said, we're on a journey with that, and it's a journey where our understanding of this grows, but also the general wider public understanding also grows at the same time. But I think the real focus for us is the needs of an individual rather than necessarily a diagnosis of an individual.
Thank you. Yeah.
The particular tribunal that I'm going to speak about this morning is the Additional Support Needs Tribunal, which sits in the Health and Education Chamber. Just to make clear, it's a bit of a complex structure. And so the tribunal has been deciding matters involving people who are neurodiverse for many years. It's not a new thing for us. It's been really since the tribunal's inception, which was in 2004. What we have seen is a rise in the volume of cases over the last 5 years, but it has always been the case that the child or young person who's at the centre of the process, whether they are the person the decision has been made about, whether they're a witness or whether they are the party raising the action, it's always been the case that the vast majority of those children and young people are neurodiverse, principally with autism, ADHD, other neurodiverse conditions, but those are the two most prominent ones. So in terms of prevalence, it's never gone down. It's always been very hefty in terms of the numbers. I would say over 90% of our cases represent neurodiverse children.
Okay, that's really interesting. So you don't think there's more prevalence, maybe just more understanding of neurodivergence overall and identifying neurodivergence, whereas in bygones, years gone past, people wouldn't have understood particular behaviours as such?
I think, so the way in to the tribunal is that the child or young person has to either have additional support needs or a disability. And you don't need a diagnosis to have additional support needs. I think it's fair to say that those who don't have a diagnosis might have more of a, if I can quote to superintendent, more of a journey to make in order to access various services. Disability is different because there's legal tests to define who is disabled. I'm not sure that I would say there's... I mean, it's a funny thing for me, actually, to hear everyone speak about neurodiversity as if we've suddenly become awake and alert to it, where it's been common to us for so many years. I think the language is becoming more accessible and people are becoming more aware, but given that the whole of our jurisdiction deals with this, it's not in any way novel to us. I think that public knowledge and public information is becoming more accessible and more wider known, so the terms and the language is more within the public arena now than it ever has been. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
I think just building on what everybody else has said, I think one of the things that has happened more recently is that people have been aware that some people are being channelled down the wrong routes, so maybe into mental health services or into the prison service, simply because of a neurodivergence. And it's not necessarily that we're maybe becoming more, well, we are probably getting more aware, but we're actually realising that a lot of people are going into the wrong system or might have been channelled into the wrong area for support. And that's not necessarily the right thing. What we're probably getting better at, and particularly our colleagues in Police Scotland, are getting a lot better at identifying the needs of people to divert people from probably the wrong service.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, we'll now move on to questions from Pam Gossel, please.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you for the information you've provided so far. Neurodivergent individuals, including those with autism and ADHD and learning disabilities, are 2 to 3 times more likely to experience domestic abuse, with reports suggesting that up to 84% may experience violence in their lives. And unfortunately, disability status is not recorded by Police Scotland when domestic abuse incidents are reported. As you might be aware, I had introduced a bill which would have required authorities to record this information. But unfortunately, the First Minister's refusal to back my bill meant that I had to withdraw it. So, taking into account that data is not collected, what systems are in place to identify neurodivergent people during different stages of the criminal justice process, especially for women who are victims of horrendous crimes such as domestic abuse? So I think, opening it up, but I think Laura and Graham, probably most of you can answer this, hopefully.
I mean, I think that we are one part of the criminal justice system, obviously, in terms of Police Scotland, Crown Office, Defence Bar, Judiciary, SCTS, and then what was SPS. I think we recognise that the best thing that we can do, whether for accused, victims or witnesses, is having as much information as we possibly can in relation to an individual. At the moment, we are working with Police Scotland in relation to the Scottish prosecution reports, and that's about providing as much information in those reports as Police Scotland can that will support us in being able to make decisions when we're considering cases. So whilst it might not be recorded in terms of the way that the police might record it, there is the ability for them to record those types of details and information, whether that be in relation to the victim or the accused. And that's important. And why that's important is because when cases come to us and we're considering it, we consider each case in relation to, we often say it, to all the facts and circumstances in the case. So as much information that we can have can really inform our decision making in relation to what we do. So in relation to an accused where there may be autism or neurodivergence, if that is an awareness of that from the police and that is shared with us, if we know what services that person has been involved with in the past, that can shape what we do when we're considering a case in terms of that route or the services that the person has already been involved in. Equally, in relation to a victim, if we're aware of that background, that again can assist us in knowing what support that person may be in place, or in fact just allowing us to know the conversation or type of conversations that we may require to have with that victim and the guidance and support around ensuring that we're providing the right support, providing the right tools for that person to be able to give evidence if ultimately we go to court. I think at this stage, it's helpful to say that COPFS receives, I think last year, 24 to 25, more than 130,000 police reports a year. They also receive more than 13,000 death reports a year. So that's the type of context of the cases that we are considering each year. There will be a range of contact from members of COPFS with victims, witnesses and accused, that can be no contact at all in terms of some of the cases, to really extensive contact when we're looking at some of the most serious cases we prosecute. So any information that we can have will be considered, and that can be provided by the defence at a later date, or indeed by the accused, victims or witnesses themselves too.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I think, in Police Scotland we're acutely aware that, data drives a lot of our business and how we approach things, and our systems that are in place to do that and collect that information are growing and changing as we move on. What I would say is that at that first point of contact, as I said earlier on, trauma-informed approach is an important thing for us, understanding the needs of the individuals and recording that where we can. A colleague there has stated, the SPR is one of those methods for passing on to our colleagues in the fiscal service and then the courts. But we also have our vulnerable persons database, which we would record any vulnerabilities that the officers picked up on during that contact, which is then shared with partners as well. I think, myself and Professor Hemming last year, we produced a 2-day knowledge exchange conference in Edinburgh, and that brought together academics, researchers, practitioners from across the world, actually, for a 2-day conference looking at some of these themes. And one of the elements that came out of that conference was acute brain injury in individuals from domestic abuse, and how the prevalence of acute brain injury, along with neurodivergence and other elements, was extremely high. So we are looking at things like a red flag scenario, where we can equip officers with a ready reckoner that will explain to them these are the things to look out for when you're dealing with a victim of domestic abuse, to take into consideration things such as acute brain injury, neurodivergence. But all these things are in their infancy for us just now, but we're working with academics and different third sector organisations to build on that knowledge so we can record it and then share it with our partners.
On which Superintendent Galley was just saying, it is a journey that they're on, and that Police Scotland are on around the identification of this. We're not there yet, but they are actually world leading in a lot of the conversations that are happening at the moment and the work that's going on, particularly Assistant Chief Constable Mark Sutherland, who's driving a lot of this work. These are conversations that were not happening previously around identification markers, particularly in Police Scotland, and they are actually driving it forward. The conference that was last year, that we're hoping to run that again next year, is really building on that work. And so, again, working with people with lived experience as well, and our colleagues in custody and healthcare and custody, about working together to identify risk and those markers as well. So it's, I know it probably feels like there's nothing happening, but I can assure you that Police Scotland are really driving a lot of this work, and it is very different to what's happening in other parts of the world.
Can I come back in? No, thank you for those responses. I'm going to come back to yourself, Graham. I think what worries me here is I hear all this good stuff happening, which I've heard from you, which is good news. However, if you can't identify and you don't collect that data, how will you know who needs that help, and how will you know to put those services in place? Also, when you pass that information on to the Crown Office, what information are you passing on if it's, I'm going to say the words, it's a guess game? Because if you're not collecting the data, the person, if they've got a disability or they need further help, and sometimes I know people won't tell you, Graham, sometimes you've got to ask as well. And I think, how could that, I'm a bit worried how information then is passed on. Is it just basically luck of the draw that if you see something, you pass it on because you don't collect it? And if you don't collect it, we won't have the data in here to understand how much help your services need as well. So I think it's about both sides. So if you can give me a bit more clarity on, if you're not collecting the data, how do you know?
So thanks very much again for the follow-up question. If we look at the identification element of it, first of all, so as an organisation, it's not the role of Police Scotland to diagnose or to screen someone for a neurodivergence or for any condition. But it is our responsibility and role to identify vulnerabilities and needs And that's what we are focusing our efforts in terms of upskilling our staff and officers. Only last week we've just finished the filming of a short awareness video with SOLD, the Sport and Offenders with Learning Disabilities organisation, where we have filmed lived experience of people in the criminal justice system who have got a learning disability or neurodivergence. We've spoken with the different social work, mental health practitioners within that area and filmed then, and also other elements within our own organisation, such as the appropriate adult scheme, such as our custody colleagues, so that we can raise that awareness across our organisation of the wide area that neurodivergence and learning disabilities can bring in. It's maybe a case, as you've pointed out, that we don't necessarily mark a specific disability type, but we do raise or we do record when there's a vulnerability or need that's identified there. And I think part of the issue we'll always suffer is sometimes this is down to self-disclosure on behalf of the individual that we're dealing with, or it's around that professional judgment. We are doing everything we can to make people feel comfortable with self-disclosure within our organisation and with the communities we serve, but also doing everything we can to raise that general awareness across the over 20,000 people that work for our organisation.
Thank you. Can I just ask one more, please? Laura, sorry, could I go back to asking, thank you, Graham, for that information. So when information gets passed to you from the police, you mentioned earlier on, what's that information look like? Is it quantitative, qualitative information? How do you find out that that person needs that extra bit of help?
So, I mean, I would just echo what Graham said. I think in discussion about the bill, that in terms of our staff, and again, just referring to that, how that contact, sometimes the first time you'll meet a witness will be when they're giving evidence, so it can be a really limited interaction. But the information comes in the police report. So again, the work that Police Scotland is doing in relation to the upskilling, if that's the right phrase, in terms of identification of vulnerabilities, means that identification, the vulnerabilities and support, it is about asking the right questions. So you're right, it will become objective to a certain extent, but that's contained within the police report, within a particular part of the police report, which will outline the information so it can come to us. In terms of specifically victims of domestic abuse, the large amount of cases of domestic abuse, most cases are prosecuted in our summary sheriff courts across Scotland. Over the course of the last couple of years, we've launched SCM, which is Summaries Case Management, and part of that is that a depute who is now conducting a domestic abuse trial will contact the victim of domestic abuse in advance of the trial. Now, that not always or not normally would have happened, but we're now proactively doing that. So that's another opportunity for the person who's conducting the trial to have a conversation with the victim to talk about what support they may need. We've also launched a toolkit for our victims information and advice staff, specifically for various categories of victims, and that includes victims of domestic abuse, and including those who are neurodivergent, with those with suicidal ideation and with mental health issues. And again, it's just about our staff being able to identify what vulnerabilities there are and what other support might be available. So it does come down to the information that's shared with us. We recognise that there is more that we can then do in terms of sharing that information with the court, sharing that information with local authorities who can provide support, and ultimately for accused persons, any information that we have to be shared with the SPS if those people end up serving any sentence of imprisonment.
Thank you very much, Convener. Thank you.
Thank you. Maggie Chapman, please.
Thanks very much, Karen, and good morning, folks. Thank you for your contribution so far. I'm going to follow on the lines of questioning that Pam Goswell has started, and really, Laura and Graham, you've both spoken about the awareness, having an awareness and training your staff, making sure that they're trained to identify vulnerabilities. I suppose, Graham, maybe this is a question for you. In a situation where you're either attending an incident, is it ever appropriate to ask the question, not directly, are you neurodiverse, but are there any support issues we should be aware of? Does that happen routinely, or should it happen routinely?
Thanks for the question. I would hope it does. I think as an organisation, I mentioned earlier on that trauma-informed approach. Unfortunately, our officers and staff meet people usually during a point of crisis in their life. That would probably equate for 90% at least of what we do as an organisation. And in those moments, you've got to be adept. You've got to listen and understand what the person is communicating to you, to understand their needs and vulnerabilities. You know, and we've focused heavily. We've had also the training called React, Don't React, which you may be aware of, which, you know, looks at different elements of how you engage with an individual to de-escalate a situation, but also to truly get to the nub of what's driving the situation that you're faced with. I think a lot of people are usually apprehensive about asking those sorts of questions, and even asking them in that direct nature, which you talked about there. But really our drive as an organisation is about raising that awareness to make it a mainstream conversation rather than something that isn't talked about. I myself, I'm neurodivergent. I got my diagnosis when I was doing my postgrad 28 years ago. I don't think I talked about it for the first 18 years of my police service. It's probably only in the last 4 or 5 years I felt more comfortable about that and promoting neurodivergence within our organisation and then within the communities that we serve. So I think that conversation is becoming easier. And hopefully our staff demonstrate that.
Thanks. Because I suppose there's that balance, isn't there, between not expecting but wanting to create the situation where people are comfortable to self-disclose, but as we've already discussed in this inquiry over the last few weeks, stigma, lack of confidence, a whole range of reasons might prevent somebody from doing so. So having somebody actually ask, do you need a little bit of extra support here? I think in some circumstances could be really useful. It might also go the wrong way. And I appreciate what you say about dealing with people in the moment of crisis. I suppose I'm also interested in barriers to... We've talked a little bit about the barriers to people disclosing or to asking those questions, but maybe once people get a little bit further into the system, what are the barriers of if it's not been flagged up, if an issue hasn't been flagged up by the police or in earlier processing, as somebody, whether they're an accused person, a victim or a witness, goes through the system, how do we identify need beyond that which is flagged up sort of right at the start, because certain people will respond differently in that moment of crisis and need might only become apparent weeks, sometimes months down the line. I don't know who wants to pick that up first. Yeah, go for it.
I think I could come in with this, Ms Chapman. I think you're quite right. There are barriers when you get to the point of imprisonment. So within the Scottish Prison Service, what we see are certainly the riskiest people in society, but we also see people with a lot of vulnerabilities, and the two aren't mutually exclusive. So ours is it's almost akin to a community. So we are spending a lot of time with people, so the information can come from various different sources. And that might be somebody speaking to a chaplain in a comfortable environment. It might be through our induction process, through our admission process, where we're asking people. But that doesn't mean that barriers don't still exist, because people within our education strategy, we know that we have to and are starting to work in different ways to engage people. And it really is about relationships. Our officers are great at relationships. It is one of the things we are very proud of as a service, because you have to live and work with people. We absolutely have to manage behaviours. We are not in the same almost incident situation that our police colleagues would be, or the limited contact that our colleagues in the courts and Crown would see. we have to manage behaviours, but we also have to understand the drivers towards those behaviours, all of which is important in us maintaining a secure and safe environment.
Yeah.
So it is to the benefit of all, the more that we can do to support people.
Thanks very much for that, Sarah. And I suppose it's safety and security for everyone. It's for the individual, it's for your staff, it's for other people who are in prison. If something is identified, however that information gets to you, if there's not a formal diagnosis, what do you have in place to support formal diagnosis? Is that an easy thing to do? How does what are the links between the prison service and health care in that way? If that is a route that actually people, we might need a little bit of, it's not just down to your staff to manage.
No,
do you have those avenues open?
And we have many people that make up a prison environment, and our health colleagues, so their target operating model in terms of the skill mix, we work quite closely with health colleagues both in government and in NHS. We obviously have social work, some of whom have been involved with people throughout a long time within their life, others shorter. Our education providers, we've used in the past things like the Do It profiler. Our new education provider has their own tools, individual learning plans, and we're really working at the moment on progressing to simplify and join up both our health plans and our prisoner progression pathway, so that the needs of people are more overt, more simple for everybody to understand and joined up.
Yeah. Thanks. Oh, one more question for you, if I may. I suppose it's a question of, do you have what you need? Because we've heard elsewhere, not thinking about the criminal justice system at all, the barriers to assessment, the barriers to support, the barriers to diagnosis, they exist in communities across Scotland. Do you see that same pressure on services? Can you actually get somebody in to speak to somebody who might need a diagnosis? Do you have? I suppose I'm asking, is there more that you need in order to create the supportive, safe and secure environment for everybody that you're wanting?
There are very few learning disability nurses across the prison estate, and there are also few occupational therapists across the estate. I won't answer on behalf of my health colleagues, but I think we could always do with more. I think the committee will also be aware that the prison population is at present unsustainable in terms of our overcrowding, and the overcrowding makes the constraints on our ability to offer services. It constrains it. So there is always more that can be done. I would also point all the way upstream, Ms Chapman, in terms of, people talked about the pathway into prison, and therefore, yes, please, if more can be done further upstream, then I think that's to the good of all of us.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Inge, you were nodding along. Do you want to come in on this?
Phenomenal nurses working in forensic services and police custody, and their link with police and how they communicate if they identify a need for somebody. That is, there is discussion around that. So there is a phenomenal identification in those forensic nurses. The challenge being is there not enough of them either. It's very, it's an area that we try to really champion within healthcare. But also for our learning disability nurses, and my colleague Natasha will be able to discuss that a bit further, I'm sure, trying to recruit nurses into learning disability nursing. At Edinburgh Napier, we're one of those providers. Yeah. It's challenging. And so there is a shortage of learning disability nurses across the board. So, there are gaps. Definitely there are gaps that we could, and I'm sure Natasha could speak to that more strongly.
Thanks very much. And Natasha, would you like to come in?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, definitely. There's definitely gaps of having learning disability nurses in the forensics unit, and sitting back and listening to everyone talk. My research really looks at inclusive research, how we can gather the voices of people with learning disabilities or neurodivergent disabilities to ensure that once they're involved in the criminal justice system, that they're feeling empowered. And I guess for me, one of the flags that I'm seeing is we're not really discussing, the questions are being asked, which are very thoughtful questions, but where is the voices or the representation of people with learning disabilities or neurodivergent disabilities in how we are training police officers, how are we training professionals in the criminal justice system so that it is an empowering experience. So yes, identification is so important, and being able to track people through the system is so important, but where are the supports that are being co-developed and co-designed by people with learning disabilities and neurodivergent disabilities to really ensure that the system moves from a very ableist system to one that is more inclusive and diverse of the different needs of people with neurodivergent disabilities. So I feel like that's kind of getting lost in some of the discussion, which I just wanted to bring up to highlight, which is so important. I think having those learning disability nurses being well trained in how to do that and actually being the experts in that area are so important to make sure that their expertise are being highlighted and that we are going to them and asking them, how can we make the service more accessible to meet people's needs?
Thanks very much, Natasha. I think you're right. We haven't really brought those voices in before. Graham, you indicated you want to come back, and then I've got a question for John.
I think Natasha's picked up on a really important point there, and I just wanted to give you one example of how we are trying to do that in Police Scotland. So you'll be aware of the National Autism Implementation Team. One of their mantras is "Nothing about us without us." So we're working with them just now. We just started 2 weeks ago a 6-month pilot where we're going to develop bespoke Police Scotland awareness training for line managers and for advocates within our organisation that looks at police-specific training or awareness around neurodiversity or neurodivergence and learning disabilities. So that's just one element. I talked earlier on about the SOLD network, working with people with lived experiences, with other professionals who work within that environment. And obviously earlier on, we talked about the Knowledge Exchange Conference we held last year, which brought together people from across the criminal justice system, brought together individuals with lived experience who have been there, lived it, and can give us their feedback. So we are using that on a daily basis now to inform how we move forward as an organisation.
Thank you. And yeah, Laura, you wanted to come in.
Maggie, if I could just come in on that point as well, because I think Natasha raises a really good point in terms of our own learning. And I think, as Graham said, we are on a journey in relation to that. But in terms of COPFS, we have a network of equality ambassadors. They're volunteers from across the service who represent all of the protected characteristics. But in particular, we have equality ambassadors for many different characteristics, including learning differences, ADHD, autism and dyslexia. We've got a dedicated neurodiversity support network for staff, and they do external outreach and discussions with autism organisations, specifically autism initiatives. But it also allows people with neurodivergence within our organisation to get in touch with the ambassadors or the network looking for support and advice. And that can be support and advice in relation to neurodivergence, in relation to family members, colleagues, but also in relation to cases that they may have where they want advice and support. One of the examples I had about that was in relation to taking evidence from a victim and seeking advice from an autism organisation and those within the network about how best to do that to ensure that the victim felt safe and supported. But that just, again, goes some way to increase awareness of neurodivergence across the service in relation to managers and people within the organisation too. And those people are then involved in the development of our policy and guidance when we're looking about those supports and tools.
Thanks, Laura. John, if I can come to you, we've been talking quite a lot about supports, recognition, identification and awareness. In your experience, when you are supporting people accused of various crimes, or people who have been remanded or are sentenced. What's your experience of the support available for the people you work with?
The immediate support when we are at the point of crisis where they're appearing or they're involved with the police and the Procurator Fiscal Service, there are the nurses who come into the custody suites, both at the police stations in Edinburgh and Livingston, and they also come into the courts. So there is a provision under healthcare for nurses who are trained to look at the needs and to make sure the welfare of the prisoners are being maintained. So we're aware of that. There's also in-house mental health practitioners based certainly in Edinburgh Sheriff Court, where I would be familiar with them. They are under the auspices of social work. And there's also a large team of social workers, at least half a dozen, who work out of the Sheriff Court. And they're all involved in the sort of triage aspect of their introduction to the custody experience at the police station and then subsequently at court. The difficulty and the issue, biggest issue, is readily understood, but by that point, they have fallen through the safety net. They are on the bottom of the process at this point. So it's crisis, it's trauma, it's all the kind of things that they are less able to deal with. So we liaise with them. We would they would give us some advice about this is where they are, this is the issues they have at the moment, and we would try and adapt our approach to supporting them through the immediate issue that they have. It's complicated. Well, it's not complicated, but it's constrained because there's time limits, there's business to be done, there is a process to be carried through where everybody needs to have it done, and there's time limits, there's shortage of resources in terms of the courts and facilities. The communication between certain elements could be better. The Law Society provides a lot of background information and training to practitioners. There's online courses and there's courses that they run for practitioners to attend. So we are aware of that aspect of dealing with people in custody. The statistics are well known. It's by far the majority of people who come into custody will have a combination of things. It's the combinations that are the complex things. Sometimes it's the masking. You'll have somebody who's been in a traumatic situation, a crisis, and that is still working through in their mind at the time when we see them. But there is also sometimes there will be substance abuse issues. There will be psychiatric or psychological issues as well, not just the developmental vulnerabilities that they have in terms of the neurodivergence or autism or things like that. So, yeah, this is a huge sandwich of things that you have to kind of bite into.
And I suppose one of the things I think that we're all interested in is prevention and trying to limit repeat contact. How? I mean, the short question is, are we getting that right?
It's very hard to quantify. I think there's a lot of information, a lot of work being done to go back upstream to work to look at what can be done to avoid them falling off their situation into behaviour which leads them to the attention of the police, both as victims and both as accused, because equally a lot of the time they're interchangeable. Yeah. It's one of the anomalies of court. 60% of people who will be victims of crime also have a criminal record. Yeah. Yeah. So there's a kind of circularity to that kind of relationship. I think the police, and I'm aware that when we deal with people who have neurodivergence and learning disabilities in custody, there's a portal or a link in the system that they use for the SPRs to flag issues with social work, the Children and Adult Mental Health Service. So there is a link across where information can be passed on. Now, sometimes it's on an emergency basis because you might be dealing with a particularly young person or a child who's got learning difficulties or disabilities and you urgently need the input of social work. But other times it's a flag or maybe not a red flag, but a lesser coloured flag to ask for support for this person post-incident, to ask the social work to intervene and to come on board. it's difficult to say because we don't get the depth of information from the people we're dealing with, and we don't have the time or the resources sometimes to do that at the time when they're in custody, because it is quite a focused kind of issue that we have to deal with and trying to liberate them or trying to get them in the right environment for the next stage. So whether they have been flagged on the system before, I always ask if they're involved with any other support agencies, or if they have needs, or if they've got a family member who would normally accompany them to things. I ask them if they've been in mainstream education, or if they've had support needs, or if they've had to go to special independent school or separate schooling. So those are the kind of half a dozen questions that is worked into the preface that we start with when we're dealing with people. So it gives us a direction of travel, and it gives us a sort of a slightly different focus sometimes when we're dealing with people. I also go into schools, and we're involved in trying to educate children about the criminal justice system, and I always preface every year by speaking to the teacher and asking the teacher, is there somebody in this class who's got neurodivergent special needs, or is there a way I have to communicate or adapt myself to deal with anybody in the class? And it's the same principle. You meet in a new cohort of people, and you should always, I think, preface with, like the police do, asking some pointed, appropriate questions about their level of need and ability to interact. But yeah, so we are very aware of it being a live issue. It's just we're way behind the curve by the time you're in a court or a cell with a prisoner. It's past the stage of starting again and looking at the what is the particular issues or the kind of finer details. We're the big picture at that point and dealing with the main issue that we have to deal with, which is whatever the crisis has caused. So.
No, thank you. That's really helpful. And I suppose it comes back to what Sarah was saying about the need to get the support in custody, in remand, in prison, right, to do that preventative prevention work.
Very important.
May I know you wanted to come in as well?
Yes, I'm not involved in the criminal justice system, obviously, but I just wanted to make a couple of observations, if I can, picking up something that Natasha said, and I'm just wondering if we could take a step back, because I do think there's a piece that's missing. I've heard reference to managing behaviour and behaviours, and I wonder if we fully grasp that someone who is neurodivergent will be experiencing points of distress or dysregulation rather than behavioural matters. And if that's not well understood, then what's going to be managed is the behaviour rather than the distress or the dysregulation. And that's a world of a difference. And I think we perhaps need to understand better. Certainly in justice, we're understanding that better. People are beginning to recognise that symptomatology or outward expressions of the particular neurodiverse condition are quite distinct from behavioural disruption or choice in how someone behaves. And that's a common misconception, that the person is choosing to behave in a particular way when what they're emanating is actually distress or dysregulation. I think if we understood that better, that would build the system better. I think that's at the foundation. And the point that Natasha made about voice, I absolutely agree with that. Voice is part of the Promise Scotland that I'm sure the committee will be familiar with, voice and co-design. And I think that that is absolutely critical. We too have been trained by the National Autistic Implementation Team, and their mantra is difference, not deficit. And I think we need to understand that much better. And I think in order to build systems, certainly in my tribunal, in that area of justice, we've had to go directly to those with lived experience. You're never going to get a better expert than those who are actually living it. And it's been good to hear the fact that people recognise that every individual experience is individual. I think that's really important. But if we're going to establish confidence in the systems that we represent around this table, those who are actually living with neurodiverse conditions need to have the confidence that the systems that we're generating are built on their actual experiences. And I've given a lot in the information note that the committee has, and I don't intend to rehearse all of that. But doing it that way was quite a different approach to take. But what it's done is it's given the children and young people who are the subjects, the parties or the witnesses in our proceedings the confidence to be able to speak more openly. They speak about not feeling the space is right to be able to tell their own stories. And I think in all of the systems that are represented around this table, we need to create the right environment. And you will all be aware that the UNCRC, I think you will know what that's short for, was incorporated into Scots law a very short time ago. And so for all of us, for anyone who's under the age of 18, as public authorities, we've got a responsibility to make sure that we don't act in a way which is incompatible with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. And there's a great deal in general comments in relation to Article 12 about how what weight we attach to the views of the child, but also the environment that we create so that that under 18-year-old is going to be able to share their story well. And preparation for that is key. And I'm not sure how well prepared someone who's neurodiverse, who finds themselves in one of the systems that are represented here, how well prepared they're going to feel about that. And that's something that we had to do an awful lot of work on in the tribunal. We had to focus on preparation. We might feel that we're preparing ourselves, but just how well prepared the person who's at the centre of it is could be another matter. Now that the UNCRC is in Scots law, then we can't skirt around that. We've got to actually apply that properly and well. And I do think that if we listen to the informed voice and we work with them in terms of developing the design, things will improve, things will be better for the person who's neurodiverse because they've been involved from the very beginning. The problem with bringing them in quite far down the line is confidence can be weakened, but also we can make so many mistakes. I can't tell you how often I've attempted to do something and then gone back to the voice of experience and had to rip it up and start again. So rather than do that, I think we're far better to go to the right start point and build our systems around the individual experience, the individual needs that neurodiverse people actually have. So I feel it's not a nice thing to do, to think about voice and to think about difference, not deficit. It's a critical thing. I think we mustn't get it the wrong way round. And I appreciate all of the questions that are coming in. They're incredibly valuable questions. But I'm thinking of some of the voices I've heard from children and young people who are saying, ask the right question. Okay. Go to the beginning. Now, I'm only speaking in relation to children and young people, but I would be very surprised if it was different for older individuals. And the last point to make is that in the tribunal, although the child or young person will very commonly be neurodiverse, their parents too may well be neurodiverse. So it's not just children and young people we're accommodating in our proceedings, we're accommodating the wealth of people who attend our tribunals who are neurodiverse. And it might not surprise you to know that in the main, the majority of the people on that side of the table will have neurodiverse needs. And the full stop, I said that would be the last thing, but the full stop is those who are not neurodiverse speak incredibly positively about the steps that have been taken to change the process and the experience. So what we do well for those who are neurodiverse will have a positive impact on those who are not, because we'll do it better.
Thank you.
Natasha has indicated she'd like to come in.
Thanks, Natasha.
No, thank you. I couldn't agree more with the comments that were just said, and I just wanted to bring some focus onto the comment that was said about behaviours perceived as challenging and how that can really get people who are neurodivergent into trouble, which also is a very disempowering experience for them when going through, the criminal justice system or interacting with various people. A lot of the times behaviours that are perceived as challenging, we know that that's a form of communication, and we know that, it's very common for neurodivergent people to have have struggles with how they communicate, kind of mainstream or how we've been socialized to communicate. And sometimes that can look like, if I'm getting overstimulated, I'm covering my ears or I'm walking away. And then that can be seen as very problematic behavior in certain situations, which then the experience becomes very disempowering for the individual, and they very much lose their voice very, very quickly, and things go downhill. So really, when we're talking about supports and making things co-produced and really getting the voices of people, or with disabilities at the forefront, really thinking about how they're communicating, how we as are interpreting their behaviors, and recognizing our own ableist bias in that, so that we're making sure that the journey is very empowering for these individuals versus a disempowering one.
Thank you, Natasha. Laurie, you wanted to come back in as well.
I just want to say thank you to May and Natasha. I mean, I think that from a Crown Office perspective, I totally agree that think that we can see and have seen the real value in those with lived experience being able to tell us about their experience, about what works, what doesn't work, what support that can be made. We're doing a significant amount of work in that in relation to our becoming a trauma-informed organisation, trauma-informed practice. But I would refer to John's point in terms of the work we are doing, that is often multi-layered. So in terms of work I'm doing at the moment, we're looking at victims of serious sexual offences, including children, where there's complex PTSD. And again, that is similar in terms of how we might interpret certain behaviours or responses, but being able to identify that actually is a root of complex PTSD, and how we might be able to support someone who has that diagnosis. But also in relation to UNCRC, a significant amount of work can done. So I think all that work just benefits the system as a whole in terms of across our organisations. When we come into contact with any person, be that a victim, a witness, an accused, a child, an adult, we are thinking about their individual needs. And we might not know, so I suppose I'm thinking about people on our front counters or people who are taking phone calls. When there's that multi-layered aspect, including addiction, it can be very difficult for them in those types of contact to be able to properly identify what support might need. But with that assistance, that input, those conversations, we're applying that approach to everybody. I think we can improve in terms of the system we're providing to all.
Thanks, Karen. I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you. We now have questions from Paul McLennan, please.
Yeah, thank you. I suppose there's a couple of questions, I think, for me. One, kind of just looking through the information that was around and about prevalence of people with neurodiversities in terms of young offenders. And what's really startling was talking about young offenders with prevalence rate of 60 to 90%. And I'll come on to that in terms of that as well. The other thing talked about coming about inequalities is that autistic people are 9 times more likely to die by suicide. Now, the prevalence rate in youth offenders more generally, the prevalence of communication orders in the general population is only 5 to 10%. So I suppose the question for me is, can we do more in terms of prevention? And are we doing as much as we can do in terms of these prevalence figures that come through? Because for me, that's a really important point. Is it's 60 to 70%, 60 to 90%, which is starting between 5 and 10% difference. So, are we doing enough at the start of the process? And Graham, I'll probably come to yourself at some stage as well, because one of the key things I think for me in speaking, because I meet with the local command team, and one of the key things they're kind of saying is they almost feel like the role is more and more social work rather than just policing. And that can be, and if you look at the prevalence figures, is there something we can do around about that? Because obviously there's an interconnection with people, and I think you talked about, Sarah, before about people who've got vulnerabilities, but then you're moving on to people then who have, we're talking about communication disorders. So is there more we can kind of do in that area before it even gets to the case of people offending? Because that 60 to 90% figure for me is absolutely startling. So, Graham, I'll maybe come to yourself in terms of the first point about the police, in terms of that, but more generally just to kind of open it up, that, because that for me is a standout figure that came through in the evidence.
Thank you very much for the question. I think, if we're honest, we ask a lot of our officers and staff on a daily basis under ever-increasing reduction of resourcing. They have to be a social worker, a police officer, a paramedic. In some cases, they have to cover whole spectrums of incidents and elements, and usually under. You talked earlier on, John, about the tight time constraints. You know, for us, it's instantaneous in a lot of cases. So we do feel the pressure of that, and we do look at our partners to step up into that space to assist us. And you know, many around the room will have experienced that as well. You know, my day job is a partnerships and prevention superintendent for our 3 local authority areas. You know, I'm acutely aware of the challenges that we have in this space. You know, suicide prevention is one of the main strands that I look at within that, and neurodivergence and learning disabilities is obviously an added element to that aspect. So I suppose for me, what I would say is we're asking a lot. We're doing a lot. We're never going to be perfect in this space or any space. But I think everything we've demonstrated today from the partners around the table is that we're all moving in that right direction in the journey.
I suppose the key thing I think, and Sarah, maybe come to yourself in terms of that as well, because I think it's almost kind of failure demand. If we're getting 60 to 90% of people who are already, you know, that prevalence rate as against 5 to 10%, you're kind of dealing with the symptoms before, in terms of actually looking before the causes. So I don't know in terms of the work that kind of goes on where you are, but that for me seems a really key focus. And of course, rehabilitation is incredibly important, as you know. So I don't know, maybe come to yourself that and then open it up in terms of that.
I think quite a lot of people have talked about the prevention side of it, and I absolutely agree. I think when you're in the criminal justice system, then there are a number of barriers. Ms Chapman noted barriers, and a number of complexities that in terms of, for us, it's then about somebody moving through to community. So obviously within that rehabilitation, but again working with our partners, because we're not a system in isolation. Yeah. You know, somebody's going back to a community, back to support. So I have seen, and it's really encouraging over the last few years, and I am grasping onto this, a shift in the way that we are thinking. So it's not just about risk, it's also about that public health model. So rather than being in a tunnel of risk aversion, risk assessment, risk management, it's about thinking about how we start to build people's resources. And we're doing that as a prison service. So, and certainly my last job was, we talked about day jobs and previous jobs. My last job, we were looking at the design of Glasgow, and one of the central things within how we wanted to see that future prison was about a salutogenic approach, which is the public health model, which is thinking about how you build resources for people. And I think on the prevention side, I've been fortunate enough to have contact recently and begin to understand more of the work of the Prevention Hub, which is a police, public health and Edinburgh Future Institute partnership. I'm not sure what you call it, but their work is really innovative, and I think those are the things that we need to capitalise on and support.
Yeah, so thanks. So I'll open up, because one of the other part of this was going to ask was about reasonable adjustments, which you've kind of almost moved on to in terms of that. But I don't know if anybody else wants to come in on the point that's been made. Inga, I've seen you nodding your head away there. So
I think the prevention, you know, that police do need to react, and they have to, and they deal with, is Graham's had a lot of problems. So people do not just come with one challenge when they come into the attention of the police. You know, come with mental health. You're just, you know, come with a load of chance. So it's sometimes not as clear cut as a prevention model right at the beginning, but I agree the work that's happening across Scotland is looking at a much more holistic approach, our systems approach to prevention and the causes of the causes, rather than being totally reactive. And I really agree, Police Scotland are right in the middle of that, right at the forefront of that work, and thinking in, you know, and that's also happening with our colleagues across the border as well, think about prevention. in a whole systems approach. So it's a big dinosaur to turn around all of this. It's just nothing, you know, these are generational issues that it can't just be fixed right away. But I think the partnerships that are really prevalent in Scotland about looking at that systems, and particularly the work in the EFI, that is, again, very different to what's happening in other parts of the world. And so I sound a bit Mary Poppins here and a bit optimistic, but it's a big bit of work to turn around. But there are certainly really strong footings for this happening in Scotland, which is, yeah, probably is a bit Mary Poppins. But, do you know, I think there is real benefits of the relationships that have been developed and the leadership that's been developed to get to that really difficult numbers that you've just, that are really challenging numbers that you've just quoted.
I don't know if anybody else wants to come in on that point. But
No. I would like to come in on a point, Paul, if that's okay. Just listening to what you're saying there and talking about the preventative thing and I suppose that working together, different sectors coming together. We were hearing, we had evidence from those within the education sector last week. I had conversations, I was previously a local councillor with local police, and you know, they would say to me, before an individual comes to us or gets to this point, they have been known to us over perhaps many years, or been a little bit, maybe they were targeted or tagged as the troublemaker, you know, in a local community or something. And most of the time, they said this individual would be neurodivergent, ADHD, and something like that, oftentimes on part-time timetables with school as well, which has given them additional time to be going out and about in the streets. So how can I ask how the police work with the education system? Do you think that could be improved in terms of that preventative measures as soon as there's a flag raised, or before that point, is there that cross-sector working?
Thank you, Chair. You know, I think we work at both that strategic and tactical level in that space. So for myself as a Partnerships and Prevention Superintendent, you know, I will be dealing with the Director of Education and different members of their team to look at how we best work together in that space. But actually at that tactical level, our campus police officers are invaluable, working with the school, working with other partners who are in that school environment to identify children, because quite often children who are neurodivergent or have learning disabilities will be seen as disruptive. We talked earlier on about the dysregulation that they may experience in the environments that they're in, and having that campus officer there at that early stage to be informed about that, how they approach those individuals and deal with them, can lead to a better outcome. But we have thousands and thousands of school children, and as we've talked earlier on, the prevalence of neurodivergence and learning disabilities is high amongst those children, and one campus officer in one school will not solve the problem alone, and that's why it has to be that holistic public health partnership approach to dealing with, I won't call it a crisis yet, but what is evolving within our education system. So I think we're dealing with it, as I said, strategic and tactical level, and we're leaning in to learn more about that as often as we can.
Thank you. Now questions from Marie McNair, please.
Thank you, Convener. My question on training has been covered, but it was reassuring to hear from witnesses that the voice of lived experience has been heard in helping develop those systems that will help everybody in the long term, whether you're delivering services or whether you're on the receiving end of it. But as we all know, we need to have that continuous learning as well, so we get it right to enable people to thrive. But it's very helpful. May, I've got to say that your briefing was helpful in terms of the first tier tribunal. It gave me a better understanding as well of the supports that are in place. I wasn't aware of that, so thank you. Sweet.
We now have questions from Rhoda Grant, please.
Thank you, Convener. Can I maybe ask some questions around attitudinal barriers? discrimination, and also possibly some systemic barriers for people. So when people are within the criminal justice system, how are they? I mean, there is a risk of misinterpretation of communication between people. It can be adversarial. Are people aware of how to communicate, how to put things to people, you know, throughout the system, not just at the entry point, but throughout the system? And Laura, you'd said earlier, quite often you might not meet somebody until you're in a court situation. I mean, not just a perpetrator or a victim, but also a witness in that situation might find that really difficult. And to get, I guess, to the truth of the matter, there has to be a way of communicating and understanding communication that doesn't cause distress or can be misrepresented.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree, and I think that is the reality. So in a summary courts, the deputy in court can have up to about 12 trials in their court each day. So there's just an inability for them to meet every witness or indeed every victim for that day. There is a process, as I say, about identifying cases, and that can again be in relation to information that we've received either from the police, from the defence, or from families, to highlight that these might be witnesses that would benefit from a meeting, if at all possible, before. In terms of communication, again, more generally in terms of the trauma-informed approach that we're taking across the whole organisation, it is about identifying how somebody wants to be communicated with. And as I highlighted earlier, people have a right to be understood. They have a right for us to understand. So we're looking at that in terms of identifying how people would like to be communicated with, what's the best way for that communication to be made. We have worked with People at Heart to try and ensure, I mean, I think when I joined our organisation more than 20 years ago, all our letters were very legalistic. You know, even if you came from a legal background, they were quite difficult to understand. We now understand we have to make our correspondence as easily understandable as possible and targeted in the right way. So have launched that training across our whole organisation to really think about how we are wanting to convey the message and how that message might be understood. I mean, part of it all, and I think the question is really important, is our role to achieve justice and to get best evidence, and we know that we will get best evidence from witnesses if they are comfortable, they are safe and they are supported. So there is a benefit to us as well in terms of being able to identify what best communication there is.
I would like to come in on that. So, Assistant Chief Constable Mark Sullivan obviously leads on neurodivergence within our organisation, but that approach is echoed across our executive team. For example, Assistant Chief Constable Katrina Payton leads on the Policing Together model within Police Scotland, and part of that, as I talked earlier on about, was the React, Don't React training. And the pillars of that are de-escalation techniques, communication skills, mental health awareness, trauma-informed policing, biases and stressors, equality and diversity, and suicide prevention. So we see these as the golden threads that is woven through all our business. So it's not just within the ACC Sutherland's portfolio, it's across the whole executive that we look at those elements.
So if someone is, a police officer is called to an incident, which could be somebody who's suffering stress, maybe acting in a way that creates alarm to others, are officers trained to identify that this person's not just causing trouble, they're actually distressed and need support rather than to be arrested and locked up?
Yeah. So we do have a lot of trauma-informed training in the organisation, but one thing you might be interested to hear about is a new product which is just about to roll out, which is, we're calling it a needs assessment for the individual that you come face-to-face contact with. And earlier on, Sarah was talking about risk averse. You know, we wanted to change the language away from a risk assessment of dealing with an individual. So it's about, what does this person need and what do I need to do? Now, part of that may be actually they just need somebody to listen to them. They may need a hug, and then we may walk out the door. But the different levels of escalation within that, once you understand the stressors involved, could mean that we refer through our distress brief intervention protocols, or that we take someone to a mental health facility to get the acute help that they need at that time. But for us, it's empowering our officers and staff to take that time to understand that everybody is an individual. They'll all have their complex elements to what's brought you into that situation with them, but to take that time to do that needs assessment to provide the person with what they need at that point in their life.
I just wanted to share some of the things that we've been learning in the tribunal along the way, which is consistent with what the police have been learning. But one of the points we picked up early on was the importance of having everyone whom that neurodiverse person will come into contact with trained. It wasn't enough to have our judiciary trained. It needed to include our staff and our clerks. And our staff attend all of our judicial training. So whilst our judiciary are learning, our staff are learning too. But one of the things that we learned a few years ago, and we took it from the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry, in fact, our clerks felt that they were the first person, and they are, that the child or young person would come into contact with, and they didn't feel that they were as well equipped as they could be to be able to make the safety begin from that moment of first contact. So we developed a child engagement plan, and the tribunal judge who's preparing the case leading up to what's going to happen at the hearing will put into that, will populate that with information that they gain from the representative or the parent, whoever's engaged in that pre-hearing stage. And that will include as much information as is valuable and important for that young person's first contact, because they're coming off the street, they're coming into an environment that's entirely alien to them. Justice is not an everyday experience. And that will include things that are significant to that neurodivergent child or young person that we wouldn't necessarily identify as significant. And I gave the example in the information paper of the child party who needed no sense. So we put out before the hearing that no one should wear aftershave or their favourite perfumes, that there should be nothing. But more than that, we discovered early morning there was a food smell coming in through our community cafe in the tribunal centre, and so we had to deal with that and make sure that that wasn't infringing, because something as gentle as smell to us was hugely significant and would have caused considerable distress for this child. But knowing what they need to feel safe, whether that's a hug or not, but some children will say early on, to feel safe, I'll need this with me. In some cases, we've had pets, not always my favourite pets. I don't like rodents, so guinea pigs are a no for me, but I steal myself. But things like a dog, you know, petting a dog before giving evidence has been a dramatic improvement in the environment for that child before they gave evidence. And we've talked a lot about trauma-informed principles, and 3 are quite prominent when it comes to your question, I think. And one is, it's the 3 C's: choice, control and collaboration. And I think if the neurodiverse person feels that they can control some of the environment and some of the circumstances that are unfolding, then that's really engaging that aspect of it. Choice is really important, and that's about what do you need in order to be able to give your evidence, in order to be able to feel safe in this space. And collaboration is about working with the agency to be able to secure that. But we added an additional trauma-informed principle in the Additional Support Needs Tribunal, because children said, that's all the fancy words that you use, but here's the word that matters most to us, and it was kindness. And so I think that is part of the trauma-informed landscape. It's maybe not part of the trauma-informed training landscape, but for us, we had to adjust to realise just how important eye contact might be or might not be. So for some children, looking them directly in the eye can be quite a negative and hostile experience. For others, that's really important. But the child engagement plan acts as that bridge. The clerk isn't involved in the decision making. They're not involved in any part of the delivery of justice, but they're the first person the child meets as they come through the door, and they already know this is what this child needs. They need the lighting dimmed, harsh lighting. This might be a bit of a challenge for someone who's neurodiverse, who's got difficulties with lighting, for example. So there are those aspects that I think are really important, not just at decision-making levels, but cascaded across all of our organisations. And the last point is when it comes to communication, we've developed a letter to the child. Even if the child's the party, they get the full decision in that situation, we still write a letter to the child. And we say, we explain the value their evidence brought, what we learned from that evidence, and we explain the decision. Now, for a lawyer, explaining a complex discrimination point of law, it's a challenge, but making that clear in plain English is something that's very important. And I would say that the letter to the child has proven to be incredibly beneficial. So children are feeding back that the letter helps them to feel important, valued, grown up. So I think anything that we can do to frame our processes into an accessible language and an accessible experience for the neurodiverse person is only going to be a benefit, but we do have to make sure that we're doing that from the front door all the way through to the decision at the end of the day.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Now I have a question from Pam Gossel, please.
Thank you, Convener. In response to one of my questions last week, the committee was told that a change in culture is necessary to better understand the needs of neurodivergent people. What are your thoughts on that, and especially when it comes to the criminal justice system?
Thanks very much for the question. I think when we started on this journey 2 years ago, ACC Sutherland was quite clear that we did need a culture change within our organisation and wider. And that's why we focused on our own people initially, because once you understand your own people, then you have a better opportunity of understanding the communities you serve. So the last 2 years we've had a delivery plan, 15 key actions within that, and that has raised that general awareness across our organisation. We have neurodivergent leaders who are clear about that and out there, and that has cascaded its way down the organisation and is now working its way out into the communities. So I think, yes, a culture change was needed. I think we're on a journey, as I said earlier on, and we're seeing vast improvements in that.
I think just building on that some of the changes that are happening within Police Scotland are thinking about the individual rather than just thinking about the risk to the organisation. So, there's often a fear of getting it wrong within the police, but I think that's changing a little bit. That, particularly the questions that people are asked about what somebody needs rather than, oh, what's the risk here? I think that's starting to change, and I think that's a really important difference when they start looking at things through a trauma-informed lens, which I think Police Scotland are really trying hard to change that.
Is there anything from the Crown Office or even Prison Service? Yeah,
I would echo Graham's point. When we gave evidence in relation to the Victims Witness Justice Reform Bill, which I think was probably about 18 months to 2 years ago in relation to trauma-informed practice, it was acknowledged that this required a significant shift across the whole criminal justice system. Again, I think we, as each individual organisation, have made significant steps in terms of the way that we improve our communications with victims, witnesses and accused. It's about how we improve the service we provide, how we improve support, but there is still plenty more that we require to do. And I think listening to the organisations today has been really helpful, learning about what other organisations are doing, and we're working much more closely than I think we may have done in previous decades. And that feeds all the way through the system as well. So I think a cultural change is needed. I think I said earlier that we talk about training and guidance, but we know that that is not enough, that we need to change across the organisation, the culture in terms of the way that we approach victims, witnesses and accused in an individual way.
I think that change is starting to happen. I think I echo all the points. I also agree that particularly the work around the LDAN bill, which brought agencies together to look at how we could meet some of the requirements that may or may not be in that bill. I think that knowledge exchange is really looking at the principles of how we embed these things rather than just some of the products, because I agree no one product alone will solve all our problems, but our journey in terms of trauma-informed or trauma awareness, our journey on brain injury awareness, we've mentioned techniques in terms of debriefing or de-escalation. We talk in this language now, but yes, we all, I think, would agree, I'm sure, that much more can be done in the area.
John?
Thank you. I'm also involved in the LDAN consultation for the drafting of the bill on the practitioner panel. But we also have the 3 panel meetings where we have the learned experience panel members as well. And it's one of the most, this job doesn't have much life-affirming things to do, but that is one of the most life-affirming things I do at the moment, is dealing with them. It's been incredibly useful and helpful. The other issues that we have to do with the trauma-informed training from the Law Society's perspective, we offer that, and it's certainly proposed to be a compulsory element in our continuing professional development. And I think the culture is changing in that we're learning that in order to allow the best evidence to come forward in the most effective way from both sides of the table, allowing a witness to be able to do that in a way which is least re-traumatising, because that's one of the issues we have to balance. You're having to conduct a criminal justice process, but you're revisiting these very difficult issues for people who have their own issues behind that, and trying to lessen and restrict the amount of re-traumatisation is very, very important. And we're learning it's a much more effective way of the advocacy skills as well. If you can get a witness to communicate more effectively and they are not becoming upset or agitated while they're giving evidence, it's a much more productive process. So this is already being built into the way that we're trying to change and develop and become more accommodating to all the people that are involved. The vulnerable witness legislation, etc., and the further developments of it has been critical. The courts are much more adaptive, and the culture's changed there because we can have remote sites where witnesses don't even have to come into the building. There's no chance that they will meet somebody that they don't want to meet, or they're scared that they might meet the person involved, whether that's from an accused or a victim's perspective. There's commissions where the witnesses come in completely independently of the trial process and give their evidence on video, and it's played during the trial. There's screens and protection, there's supporters in court. So there's a huge change in my working life in the last 30 years. None of those things existed 30 years ago. So there is definitely a change, whether you call it a change in culture or just a recognition that we need to improve things. It's definitely heading towards a better experience for everybody involved.
Can I come back in? Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you, Convener. Obviously, having the committee in place is very important, that we bring in the right evidence and we make sure that we have the right actions to put forward as well to the Scottish Government especially. So it would be good to hear from each one of you if there's one thing, I'm sure there's many, if there's one thing that you would like us to take forward from today's evidence, or something that you also experience maybe in your organisation that we could ask the Scottish Government for, to make, a bit more easier for neurodivergent, whether it's, you know, it's probably especially, I'd say, victims coming through, to make sure that, you know, they're listened to, but the proper service is there as well. So if you could probably give one thing, it'd be great, yeah.
Thanks very much for the question. You know, as I've explained earlier on, as an organisation, we're doing everything that we can do to make this situation better for everyone. But we can't do it alone, and it requires our partners to step up into spaces. And one of those areas is probably around the appropriate adult scheme. And the appropriate adult scheme is one of the elements that was looked at within the LDAN bill, and one of the elements that may come out when the bill is put forward. And that's provided to us by the 32 local authorities. And I suppose if there is going to be more emphasis on that, that needs to be funded, and it needs to be delivered in a way that is equal across the 32 local authorities. So to support policing, we need partners in spaces like that to provide the service that's required. So I suppose that is one element that we'd be keen to hear what the Scottish Government plans to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think similar to Graham, I think a lot of the work that we do in terms of supporting victims and witnesses is very ably supported by third sector organisations, again, in terms of charities and support organisations. And without them, we can't provide the level of service or support that we wish to in relation to victims and witnesses, especially who are going through a really difficult period. So I think just to ensure that those organisations are there, supported and funded to be able to provide that work. I think Graham's point in relation to local authorities is very well made across a number of different areas. I was Sheriff and Fiscal for Lothian Borders for a number of years. That crosses a number of local authorities, of which have different services, have different programmes. It can make it quite challenging when an individual lives in one area but commits a crime in another area about what support can be provided. So some consistency around those types of programmes I think would be really helpful in terms of being aware what can be offered to victims, witnesses and accused.
For me, I think it'd be really important that we continue to look at somebody as an individual and their individual needs rather than, you know, siloing people into either mental health pathways or neurodivergent pathways or whatever. Nobody comes with, or very few people, none of us come with a single need. And I think there is potential that people could be siloed as we all work really hard in different pathways, that we forget that there's a person in the middle of this and they get overshadowed. And I think it would be really valuable to think about how the current thinking in different organisations collaborate to see that individual instead of individual silos. And of course, it wouldn't be worth me as a researcher not to say we need to invest in research to understand the voice of people's experiences coming through criminal justice system. There is a lack of research funding to support our understanding that has the individual, you know, co-producing and working within that research space. We need to continue to champion the research in this area.
I think support in the headspace to really try and progress some of these things. I think it is difficult for the prison service at the moment to not. Well, we have to prioritise certain things with regards to our population. So it is really about the appropriate levels, the appropriate numbers, the appropriate funding to actually really lean into this space and work with our partners. The principle. Sneak in another one. The principles that were discussed as part of the LDAN working group and really progressing that forward would also be helpful.
Well, as a judicial office holder, I don't think it's appropriate for me to comment on matters of policy. However, I will say that we've made the most progress in this area by listening, learning and letting those with lived experience lead us. And I would say that for me has to be at the foundation of everything. Anything we've developed that's been progressive and positive has come from starting at that baseline. And I think, above all things, voice co-design, I'm drawing that from the promise, but I think it applies equally across here, will really assist all of us as we try to make better progress and better inroads in this area.
Is it Natasha's indicated she would like to come in? Natasha, please.
Sorry, thank you. I was just going to add to that the importance of co-production, of course, of having, this is a very ableist system that we're operating in. So making sure that, to make it inclusive, we need to have the voices up front and center in trying to shape what a more inclusive system is going to look like, and having it be, proactive rather than reactive. So there's no point in coming up with policy reforms and decisions and plans and then asking people with disabilities what they think. It's just a waste of time, really. How do we bring their voices to the forefront? How do we know how to do that? And in doing that, sometimes, a lot of the time, sometimes we have more of the voices of autistic people or people with ADHD, and we kind of lose the voices of people with learning disabilities. So really making sure that the voices of people with learning disabilities are at the forefront as well, and not getting lost in that. And also, my last point would just be, sometimes the default, because it's the easiest thing to do, is look at sensory accessibility. How do we change the physical environment? But a real important piece that tends to kind of affect whether or not something is going to be inclusive and accessible is that cognitive piece, that cognitive accessibility piece that is so difficult, but yet will really determine the effectiveness of whether a system is inclusive. So if we don't have that cognitive accessibility piece, it really is going to deter the effectiveness and really kind of isolate people with learning disabilities even more. So that would be, I guess, my thing to bring back.
John, have you got something in the or not? If not, it's fine.
My wish list, I think, having worked on the Eldan bill now for 18 months or so, to bring that to fruition in the following years, I think would be a major step forward. And it has a separate justice part, which is I'm particularly involved in, and it covers of almost everything that we've been talking about here today. That's my dream.
Thank you.
We now have... OK, you've indicated you wouldn't like to come in. That's OK. I was just making sure that all members have asked everything that they would wish to ask. That's great. Thank you very much. So that brings our first roundtable to a close. We will suspend briefly for a changeover of witnesses for our next panel. Thank you. Welcome back. We will now move on to our second roundtable this morning, and we will hear from groups representing people with neurodivergences. So before we go on to questions, I would like everyone to introduce themselves. I'll begin and then I'll go round from my right. So I'm Karen Adam, MSP, convener of the committee.
Thanks, Karen. Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie Chapman. I'm the Scottish Green MSP for North East Scotland and Deputy Convener of this committee.
Good morning. My name is Bill Colley. I represent the Scottish ADHD Coalition.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. My name is Pam Gosso. I'm a member of the Scottish Parliament for the West Region, for the Scottish Conservatives, and also a member of this committee.
Morning, I'm Jenny Miller. I'm Chief Executive of PAMIS, an organisation that supports children, young people and adults who have a profound learning and multiple disabilities in their families.
Good morning. I'm Marie McNair, MSP. I am a constituency MSP for the Clydebank and Mulgai constituency, and that's in the west of Scotland too.
Hi, Doreen McLaughlin, Chief Executive of Scottish Autism, a national charity supporting particularly in regulated care autistic people who also have a learning disability. So I'm keen to get their voices across today.
Thank you. Tess White, MSP, North East Region, Scottish Conservatives.
Good morning, I'm Rob Holland and I'm Director of National Autistic Society Scotland.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Paul McLennan. I'm the SNP MSP for East Lothian.
Good morning, I'm Danny Cosgrove, the Chief Operating Officer and co-founder of Stronger Together for Autism and Neurodivergence, known as STAND. I'm also a parent of neurodivergent children and I'm neurodivergent myself.
Morning, I'm Rhoda Grant. I'm Highlands and Islands Labour MSP.
Okay, thank you all. So I'm going to kick us off with the questions this morning. Given the increasing recognition of neurodivergence in Scotland and long waiting lists for autism and ADHD assessments, what are the main barriers to getting a diagnosis? If you wish to come in, just please indicate.
I think, in short, when we see places like Aberdeenshire and Forth Valley ceasing diagnosis assessments for adult services, that's one answer to the issue.
Okay. Yeah.
I think there's a misconception that the patient journey begins when you put on a wait list.
Yeah.
The patient journey begins when a parent or a young person themselves recognises that they have a problem and seeks help. And that's very often at primary healthcare level, so going to the GP. And that you can get a knockback and a false negative diagnosis at that point. So having a greater level of sensitivity and providing tools perhaps for GPs to recognise the possibility of a neurodevelopmental disorder would be a major step forward. They exist. They're just not implemented at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
I think for our group, those that have a profound learning disability, there's sort of diagnostic overshadowing and a lack of willingness even to acknowledge that that group might have alternative symptoms and diagnoses as well. And I think there is a distinct shortage of speech and language therapists and occupational therapists, both in children's service but particularly in adult services, that make it increasingly difficult for families to get the support for their relative.
Mm-hmm. Danny?
For the children that we support, I'm on the ground with them most of the week with the families, and what we hear a lot is that because they're having to go through school most of the time or a GP, it very much depends on if that person is believed. If the child is masking, they're told they're fine. That's seen as success, really, if a child's masking at school, and then that means that they won't put forward the paperwork to go for diagnosis, and it's really hard for parents to show that evidence.
Yes, I mean, the Health Committee looked at an inquiry into diagnosis and the barriers around diagnosis, and particularly the lengthy waiting times that go along with that. So we absolutely support the recommendations from that inquiry. I think at the heart of it, the system is simply not resourced to meet the need of the number of people that are seeking a diagnosis for autism, and indeed broader in terms of neurodevelopmental assessments. So while the Scottish Government has committed some funding in the short term to work on this, I think what is needed is very much a longer term approach with a longer term funding settlement that addresses the needs of the workforce there, but then also, as Bill has said, it's not just about the assessment itself, it's about pre-diagnostic support and post-diagnostic support as well, so that those that are waiting get the support that they need, whether that's in education, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's in the health or care system as well.
Thank you. Brilliant.
Yes, just to pick up on the term diagnostic overshadowing, I think there are two areas where there is a need for quite an urgent assessment and possible diagnosis, and that is children entering the care system or at risk of entering the care system, where currently there is a requirement that they have a statutory assessment, but the assessments aren't available, particularly if there's a concern about a neurodevelopmental contribution. And very often these children would be labelled with things like attachment disorder, when in fact, when we look at the family dynamics, there's more to it than that going on. And the other is children entering the criminal justice system. The same would apply, that it would be helpful for all concerned to inform decision-making, to have a comprehensive view on the causation of the child's needs.
Interesting. Anyone else? Yeah.
Yeah, just adding largely to what Rob was saying, there are inconsistencies across Scotland, and I pointed them out in my earlier statement. But there's something also around having consistency in terms of diagnosis criteria and assessment. And our report done with autistic people's organisations, showing the experiences autistic people face when they're going through assessment. I think that really brings that to the fore. So totally agree with Rob. There's a need for a neurodevelopmental pathway, and as you've just said, that starts almost before any assessment or diagnosis, and particularly is followed up with proper support, rather than just a piece of paper very often that signposts you to local services.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, thank you. We'll now move on to questions from Maggie Chapman, please.
Thanks very much, Karen, and hello again, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you for that initial contribution. I want to pick up on a couple of things that you've said. Rob, you talked about the need for pre- and post-diagnosis support. Can you just say a little bit more about what is working, if and when it works, and what's actually what do you mean by adequate and appropriate pre- and post-diagnostic support?
Sure. Yes, I think it's really, really important, and particularly because we want to live in a world where getting support is not dependent on a diagnosis, and getting a diagnosis shouldn't be a gateway to support. The reality is it often is, in some cases, particularly in sectors where, you know, resources are under a huge amount of pressure. So getting that diagnosis can often be that gateway to support, even though it shouldn't be. I'm talking about education in particular. I think in terms of good pre- and post-diagnostic support, there is a lot out there, particularly in the voluntary sector, information, advice and guidance, but then also support around helping people understand more about their autistic identity, the strengths and challenges that they face, the sorts of what we call social navigation strategies and things like that that people can develop based on their strengths, so that they can be more included in whatever it is that they are doing. The Scottish Government has funded the Autistic Adult Support Fund, which is for precisely this reason, to provide pre- and post-diagnostic support for adults, in the recognition that there are, within the 60,000 people waiting for a neurodevelopmental assessment, a third of those are adults, and that is a population that, as there's been a step change in understanding about autism and awareness about autism. There are an established pathways for children. There are now adults, often parents of those autistic children, recognising those autistic traits and then in turn seeking a diagnosis and then the support. So I would draw the committee's attention to the Autistic Adult Support Fund and some of the good practice that has come out from there, particularly for adults, which predominantly is delivered in a peer support environment led by the autistic adults themselves, developing, sort of looking at a range of different areas around understanding, identity, masking, energy levels, social communication and things like that. I should declare an interest as a recipient of the National Autistic Society Scotland is a recipient of the Autistic Adult Support Fund, as there are a number of other organisations.
Thanks very much, Rob. Jenny, if I can come to you, can you just, I mean, I'm familiar with some of the work that PANAS does being based in Dundee. Could you just say a little bit more about why the post-diagnostic support you do is so important and how you deal with the gaps in provision that are so apparent?
Yes, it's really interesting because I was just making a note. I think there are huge gaps, and partly I was listening in earlier because we often work in silos, and I think that collaborative approach, I mean, it has been really useful. The LDAN bill has brought us all together, so we work now very closely with Rob and with Dorrie, looking at what we all have to offer, and our group are quite unique. They don't have that verbal communication. So how do you diagnose and then how do you support individuals? And quite often with personal assistance and a workforce that are undervalued and underpaid and undertrained and undersupported. And that's why I think working with specific organisations that have those skills that enable a workforce. But I think we need to do far more collaborative working. It feels a bit of a battlefield where the third sector often fighting for packages of care that really support individuals. And one of our real issues at the moment is not having that support for younger people as they get older, often with single parents, and what happens then. And we're really worried it's going to be a new going out of area and another group that will need to be coming home. So I think there needs to be a real pooling of collective wisdom, as we call it, to get people together, because these are often the most complex individuals that we have that we often really don't understand, and that because they're not being understood, they're not being supported in the right way. And now I think I'm waffling on, sorry.
No, that's really helpful, Jenny, thank you. I mean, I suppose the point on collaboration is well made, and we've heard it repeatedly over the last few weeks. I think one of the challenges, as some of you have already indicated, is you're forced into positions of competition almost because of funding constraints and that kind of thing. And I think we recognise that, and we'll, as a committee, we'll see what we can suggest on that. But as Jenny was talking, Bill, you were nodding away, and I wondered if you wanted to come in and talk a little bit more as well about the support your organisation provides and how it sort of navigates the gaps, the challenges and the barriers you come across.
So the Scottish Coalition isn't in itself a support group for patients, it's a support group for support groups, and it aims to build a network of local support groups. Given that I think it was NHS Tayside in there when they closed the waitlist to all but the most complex cases, said that you can just go out and get support in the community, which I think is a very naive thing to say if you haven't audited what support is available, where you haven't assessed whether it's effective at reducing symptoms and impairment. And I would pick up, as well as looking at the way that we as third sector collaborate, I think there is a really big area for improvement and progress in terms of the relationship between the NHS and the patient group, but also the NHS, CARMS in particular, and third sector organisations. And that ought to be a proactive relationship. It shouldn't be us reacting and trying to get something done. It should be ongoing. So local ADHD support groups are often a bit wary about treading into territory that they think belongs to the clinicians. And it would be very, very helpful if, at every local level, there was some sense that there was a spider's web of links between the clinicians and the local organisations. I thought that Natasha from Toronto, in the final session, hit several nails on the head when she talked about co-production and about, as well as obviously politicians have to develop some sort of top-down approach in terms of policy and legislation, but probably more important and more effective is to develop this ground-up approach and to look at the resources available and to make the most of them. And I don't think that's happening at the moment.
Thank you. And I suppose, Dorry, can I bring you in on this as well? Because I think there's a shared theme, and I'd just be interested in your reflections.
Yeah, I mean, we provide advice line services, and we also have initiatives like Get Set for Autism. But it kind of starts at the beginning of somebody's life journey. So one of the initiatives that we have in Fife is known as the Flourish programme, and it's supporting young neurodivergent people and their families, carers and parents. They don't have to have a diagnosis, so you're starting at quite a young age in terms of understanding the autistic person themselves, potentially understanding what they need and being able to find ways to be able to articulate it. That sets people up very well as they do their whole life journey. I'm now going to go to the other extreme, and this came out of the LDAM bill. Until we have systemic change throughout employment, throughout the NHS, throughout education, we heard it this morning, the criminal justice system, so that we have more than just 1 hour of autism awareness training, but we actually have people like May, who worked for the Children's Tribunal Service, really understanding, really co-producing, and coming up with cultural change that means that autistic and neurodivergent people are properly supported. We can only take people and help them get so far before they will then get into that crisis situation in the NHS or in education or in the criminal justice system. And we did a social return on investment analysis of our Flourish programme. And for every £1 spent, conservatively, we believe that £5 is saved to the public purse or the economy in the future. And I think there's a responsibility on the third sector, as much as on the public sector, to be working together collaboratively to produce that kind of evidence.
Thank you. That's really helpful, and I think we often miss that longer-term return on investment issue when we just looking at the crisis that's in front of our face. Danny, in your earlier remarks, you talked about masking being seen as success, and I wonder if you could just tease that out a little bit and how it links into both the need for diagnosis, if diagnosis is needed to get support, but also how it sort of affects just the whole support available, or the whole support that might be available for the person who is masking.
Yeah, so we see this. This is where this gap comes in as well. We see a lot of this masking all day at school, and then coming home and behaviours. I call it the Coke bottle example. They hold it in, and then they get home and they explode.
Yeah.
And it is seen in school as a lot of the time compliant or successful, but then we're expecting teachers to be the ones to give the evidence, and they're not seeing the evidence. And it really, because you can have an amazing teacher. My son's got an amazing teacher who would listen and help you, but we do also see a lot of families who have children who go to school and their teachers aren't willing to do that. They're saying, oh well, they're fine here. They're fine here. If we done a referral for every parent that thought their kid was having a hard time, we would be here all day. We've actually heard that being said. And God, I'm lost by the question. We'll go in there. But can you go back to the point? Sorry.
Yeah, no, not at all. I think that's really helpful. One of the things that so I suppose if we are to support children not to mask, what's needed? what's needed in the classroom, what's needed in the school environment, so they don't go home and explode, and then you've got this complete mismatch.
I think that is individual to the child, and it's about talking to the parents. It's about having the regular meetings, the regular team around the child, child planning meetings, whatever that is, taking that down, minuting it, you know, and working off that regularly. Quite often what we see is these supports put in place when the child's in crisis. And then we also see them taken back away when the crisis is over, which is very difficult. It's got to start from the people that are, you know, living with their child. They're at the paediatrician appointments with their child. They're at the dentist with their child. They're in all these different situations. The teachers are only seeing them in that one environment. So it really needs to be taken back to, you know, parents or carers or, you know, those living with their children normally know them best.
Yeah. And is there a challenge, or is there a barrier, or is there just people just don't believe that there's the situation because you don't have a piece of paper, you don't have a diagnosis, or you don't have that coherent body of evidence because of masking, because of that different situation? That must have a pretty detrimental impact on family life, never mind the individual
It
child.
definitely does, and not to take it personal, but I've got 2 children, one diagnosed, one not, for that reason.
Right.
And I support a lot of kids, families with that exact issue of them being that in between. And we've actually seen like local authority training that actually instructs staff not to use emails, use phone calls, so that subject access requests can't be made. To, you know, not use children's names in these emails because of subject access requests. And it actually tells them to look at correspondence that's sent by email through the lens of a solicitor, so that they can't be challenged later on things that are going wrong now. So parents can actually access that information to get the evidence to then show that they might need a diagnosis. It's really hard.
Yeah, it seems like none of that is done with the interests of the child in mind. I wondered if, given how the conversation has developed, does anybody want to comment on the impact of the challenges around diagnosis, the lack of diagnostic pathways in some places, or the very long delays to diagnosis, what that does, given what you said, that diagnosis shouldn't be necessary, but often is, to get support?
Can I
Yes,
possibly just come and pick up on something that Danny says? I think she said something very important at the beginning, which was about talking to parents. And very often, the schools in particular, and I worked in school as an additional support needs manager, and often the response is very reactive and defensive rather than proactive. And one of the most important things I used to do with parents is go to their homes, sit down with a cup of coffee and talk to them. And I would say I'm thinking of a particular child who was about to be excluded from primary school age 9 for violent behaviour. And when I sat down and said to the mother, so when is your son most happiest and most soothed and most content? And she said, when we go to Tesco's, he goes to the spice counter and he goes to the bakery section because he likes the smell. And we thought, can we introduce that into a school? Can we have a bread maker? And we decided it was impractical. But the other was that he really liked being held tightly. He didn't like being cuddled by his mum, he liked being cuddled by his father. And we translated that into when he was becoming de-escalated, he would go into the support base and roll up in a rug on the floor. And it sounds very bizarre, but that's a no-cost solution, and it comes from speaking to the parent. And he is now at university. He didn't get excluded. He had a very successful primary and secondary education. So I think that it is about sometimes reframing our thinking and most importantly of all, is giving respect to parents. Parents are a source of invaluable information, and I don't think we necessarily use that enough.
Thanks, Bill. That's really... Yes, of course.
Because, Danny, I was nodding vigorously. I think as an organisation, you know, we really promote, and we have undergraduate students all the time to get them to understand that families are the absolute experts so often, and that isn't recognised. And I've just had a bit of a rant about getting it right for everyone, because in the training there, it doesn't look at focusing on family carers as being real experts. And we've just had a real battle with the guardianship and a court case about people not believing what the families say, and that has been really, really traumatic for all of the people involved. It's been dragged out over well over a year, but because the families were being accused of making things up and not. But they were the absolute experts. They understand their child. And then we have people that come in that don't understand and don't have the training and are making judgments, which I think, is a total breach, really. Sorry, I'm very passionate.
No, don't. Please don't apologise. Anyone else, Rob? Yeah.
Just building on your question about the consequences of not having a diagnosis or not having an early diagnosis. And I think, what we know is that if you have a diagnosis early on in life, you're less likely to need mental health support down the line. And I think, that's really important to keep in mind, because the diagnosis is not just a piece of paper. It's that kind of it's not necessarily even the starting point, but nevertheless it is a point for you to start developing those important strategies that work for you. It's that point where you can access support, and as we've said, that shouldn't be the case within school. For example, there is the Getting It Right for Every Child model, and that's not diagnosis specific. But nevertheless, because of resources, it can be a gateway to support. And we know, for example, that particularly specialism within education, speech and language therapies, etc., is often dependent on the number of children that are diagnosed in that situation. So it is a gateway in that situation. Likewise, it's important in terms of social security as well. But there's also the very human benefits of its, validating and life-affirming. People often say to us, I thought I was broken or there was something wrong with me, and this diagnosis actually fundamentally changed my perception about myself, my identity, into a positive thing as well, which I think is really important. So if you have a child or a young person waiting 2 or 3 years, which is absolutely conceivable at this time, during those formative years of their life in education, that can have a huge impact. Yeah. We know, for example, transition is a huge challenge for a lot of autistic children and young people. Changes in routine, structures, relationships, supports, etc. So again, not having that diagnosis and the support that goes along with it can be hugely detrimental. It is also a risk, not having that diagnosis, that you might pursue or be encouraged to pursue other types of support which might not be the right ones for you, or you might find yourself within the mental health system going down a different pathway which might not be appropriate, and we know that that's happened in a number of occasions. So it's about getting the right support and also ensuring that you don't get the wrong support or end up on the wrong pathway.
That's helpful. Dori, did you want to come in on this?
A quick thing to add. First of all, I know personally a lot of autistic people who know that they're autistic, identify as autistic, but choose not to have a diagnosis, and that's great and works well for them. I think Rob and Ron, isn't it, were absolutely right. It's often the start of a journey when you can learn about yourself, learn about your identity, learn about strategies that work for you in terms of having a diagnosis. But it's not the be-all and end-all, which is why, for example, the Flourish programme, you just have to identify as neurodivergent. You don't actually have to have a diagnosis. So I think it is really important. But the practical implication of not being able to get a diagnosis through the NHS when you think it would be helpful for you is that you go to the private sector where there might not be consistency in terms of the criteria that's used, and it can cost you £4,000 or £5,000, which for many people is not going to be affordable.
Thank you. And we heard also then sometimes NHS providers or other public providers won't recognise a private diagnosis, which is a problem. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Karen. I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you. Now I have questions from Rhoda Grant, please.
I didn't.
Oh, you know. Okay. Thank you. We'll go to Pam Gossel.
Thank you, Convener. Employment is the best solution to poverty, yet only 29% of autistic people are employed compared to more than 80% of the general public. Unfortunately, many employers do not have sufficient understanding of what it means to be neurodivergent, leading to poor workplace experiences and sometimes discrimination for neurodivergent staff. So how are you working with employers to combat that stigma?
As best we can, we, through our Elevate programme, work with employers across the whole, the whole spectrum. So it might be IT employers, it could be shops, retail, hospitality. And that's about not providing the kind of 1 hour or trying to persuade them not to have the 1 hour training, which is going to make you sensitive to every neurodivergent person's needs, but to really get an understanding. And particularly because some of the changes that you can make to better make employment for neurodivergent people make it better for everybody. So, having quiet spaces to go to rather than everybody being in an open plan office is probably going to work as much for the neurotypical me as it is for somebody that's autistic. But of course it isn't mandatory, and when there's low unemployment and everybody is trying to get more people into the workplace, the people are more often, the private sector in particular, are going to be more willing to spend some money on that because they see a business outturn. But actually, if it makes the place where people are working better, then so be it. That's absolutely great. But we hear through our advice line so often people really struggling at work, really trying hard to navigate, very often not the tasks that they're being asked to do, but the social and the political aspects of what they're being asked to navigate. And that's the bit very often where there's a lot of learning for employers.
Thank you. Anybody else want to come in?
Happy to come in. You framed the question very well, because the research that we've done with employers demonstrates that they are quite worried about getting it wrong in terms of supporting autistic people. And I think, that's what we've got to keep in mind, that there is a low employment rate, but it's not that employers are actively trying not to employ autistic people. It's that they're worried about getting it wrong. They feel they don't have the right information, they don't have the right understanding, the right skill set, the right strategies, the right culture even, and therefore they're naturally risk averse to that, which I think has a knock-on effect in terms of work culture, recruitment practices and all of those things. So just like Scottish Autism, we also provide an offering for employers, whether that's training for staff. We also have an autism-friendly award for employers, so kind of an accreditation that you can go through that looks at your recruitment practices, your cultures, your systems, processes, etc. And then you get the award at the end of that, which a number of employers here in Scotland have done. But I think there is something about, and perhaps this is a role that government can play in terms of corralling the information about what good practice really looks like into one place, because that is something that employers say. They don't know where to go to get the good practice information about what they should do. They can obviously get it on our website and get it on a number of websites, but nevertheless they are saying that they don't know where to go for it. So perhaps there is a role to bring that together into one place where employers can access it easily, and perhaps it's going to the forums that they inhabit, not just in the third sector, but the sector bodies and the umbrella organisations for employers.
Thank you. Jenny or Danny, is there anything? Or no?
Rob, we obviously work with children and families, so we don't deal much with actual adults in employment, but completely agree with everything Rob said.
That's fine.
Sorry, really very briefly. The figure for the number of adults with ADHD in Scotland who haven't been diagnosed is between 94 and 96%. So by the time they're in the workplace, it's unlikely that they've been diagnosed. And if we're called in any way, it's firefighting, and it's too late. Very often. So as Dory says, very often it's not so much about the work itself, although that can be a problem in terms of schedules and meeting deadlines and so on. But it's the social environment, how to deal with management, and it's how things can escalate very quickly, because people with ADHD often have very, very low self-esteem and therefore react very quickly if their work is criticised. And that's largely because people with ADHD are their own worst critics. They realise they're underperforming, and it makes things very difficult for them, both in the education system, but then later in life in employment.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay.
Thank you.
We now have questions from Paul McLennan, please.
Thank you, Convener. A couple of things, I think, for me. One, you will all be aware of the Royal College of Psychiatrists paper that came out, the 10-point plan. One of the key things they mentioned was about having national guidance on reasonable adjustments. And I think that's really important, but I think one of the key things, in my own experience, I was a counsellor for 15 years before this, but also in terms of dealing with parents in East Lothian at the moment, there are different aspects of it. One, even within schools, the way that schools interpret it is very different from teacher to teacher, so I think there's a need for that. And I've been doing work with Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists, and they had external support for parents in East Lothian, many with neurodiversity. Now, the council then said we don't need external support, and have removed that, which again has caused real issues for parents in terms of that. And I think it's a multifaceted issue in terms of what we're looking for. I suppose the question I'm trying to get to is what's your views in the RCP paper, particularly about reasonable adjustments, but what more can be done in terms of where local authorities are already operating just now, where they don't even have a uniform policy within schools, never mind within the local authority itself. So, Danny, I know you and I have discussed this in terms of this, so I'll probably come to yourself in terms of that. But it is an issue that I see every week from parents that I engage with in terms of this issue. So, but Danny, I'll come to yourself first of all.
So are we talking about the issue of reasonable adjustments?
Reasonable adjustments, but just even within schools, and you'll know we've had we've had discussions around about adjustments. You have one parent, one teacher who will understand it a little bit more, one teacher will understand it a little bit more than another, and so even from class to class, it's different in terms of that. So there's no uniform school policy, never mind a local authority policy on the issue.
Yes, exactly right. So we often talk about the postcode lottery, which I completely agree with, but there's more to it. There's the person lottery, like you say. There's the actual teacher, and whether that teacher is willing to put in the reasonable adjustments. And then the issue can be children, especially when they get to high school, they change teachers, each subject. So you can have one teacher putting in the reasonable adjustments, the next one not. Someone taking away an early lunch pass, or not giving the fidget toys. There's the framework there, there's the guidance, there's the legislation there, but there's no kind of accountability, or parents don't even know it exists. It's most of the time, some of them they do, but they don't know how to evidence it, they don't know how to prove it, they don't know how to fight the teachers on it, or fight the school on it, or fight the local authority on it, because they don't have the energy most of the time. And then they can get it, I've seen parents fighting for a year, 2 years, to get something important in place in school. Teacher finally, understanding, putting it in place. 6 weeks later, teacher changes and it's gone. We've actually had this with one of our volunteers. Her little girl is in a primary school, had an amazing first year, primary one, everything in place, was going great. Next year, teacher changed, head teacher changed, classroom moved about, sensory space taken away. Now she's refusing to go to school, she's feeling sick, but it still becomes back to they're blaming what's going on at home. They won't accept, and there's no accountability there for it.
Yeah, thanks for that. Paul, I can see you ready to come in there. I'll come with you.
I think I found the question very interesting because it throws up this sort of paradox that reasonable adjustments are necessary, but we also recognise that our populations, whether it's an autistic population or an ADHD or a neurodivergent population, we're talking about heterogeneity. And so you get these bizarre situations in school where a support worker will say that they looked up all the sort of adjustments about autism and they gave the child a book on dinosaurs and it didn't help at all. You know, that level of simplicity of thinking. And what I found as a manager, what did work was we had an outreach worker, an autism outreach worker, who would go particularly into primary schools, and she would, with her, through an autism lens, look at the experience of the child in that school and then make the adjustments, rather than it being an off-the-peg, top-down solution. It was bottom-up. So, yes, obviously, having some sort of guidance on reasonable adjustments would be helpful, even if it's just to release, say, teachers from the belief that a child has to go to assembly for that child to be getting an inclusive education. Sometimes you need to give permission for people to think differently.
I think it goes back to collaboration as well, doesn't it? I mean, I think it is becoming increasingly difficult for teachers to do the 1,000,001 jobs they're asked to do alongside practice education. But I think, you know, having a collaborative approach across sectors, but with health practitioners as well. I mean, I was an occupational therapist, and many years ago, you know, we were in schools and working collaboratively with teachers, sitting in the staff room, you know, discussing how best to tackle, because every child is an individual. But it's now, you know, I remember the allied health professions underneath a bridge rather than walking side by side. And I think we need to think about how we support each other through that period.
And I think that's a really important point because, again, engaging with parents. If the kid leaves school or doesn't go to school, and it's probably maybe more in secondary, it's very difficult for them if the regional adjustments aren't made for the kid to go back into school. And quite often, rather than going to school, it'll be either home educated or just don't go to school at all, and that can become a real issue in terms of that as well. So I really do that. So, Dora, I know we had a discussion as well, but I don't know in terms of what you kind of find in say in your own area.
Yeah, I think you just hit the nail on the head. When school doesn't work, in terms of whether that's reasonable adjustments or whatever, then young people are excluded or informally excluded and therefore not recorded. And the knock-on impacts of that is often a parent can't work. And so therefore there's financial difficulty and we're at risk of child poverty. I can't remember who it was, it might have been you, Jenny, talking about teacher education, because getting it wrong is costly in financial as well as human terms. One of the things we're trying to do, and we can certainly bring to the MSPs here and our third sector folk as well, is doing some work in CLACs with the council. So we have an autism practice improvement programme, so going into mainstream schools to really unpick what good autism practice looks like, and it doesn't have to cost a lot, and that will cover things like reasonable adjustments, but also working with the young people and their families who are in that situation that they've been excluded. So it isn't just sitting at home being home educated or more likely not being educated at all. And a lot of that, even in the early stages of that work, has shown that once the young person understands their own identity and the parents understand their own identity, then things start to get better. We need to get that into schools as well, though, so that it's an iterative process. And we're hoping to do an evaluation on that and actually have a bit of proof of concept. This works. And it doesn't cost that much, but the human impact is immense.
Dory, I think that's a really important point, because again, in dealing with the whole family, it is the whole family, and it might be on the child itself, but the whole family is impacted by this, and I think it comes back to the point I think you made, Jenny, about being collaborative and inclusive as possible right at the start. And it's about co-production. Again, Bill, you talked about it's co-production right at the start of this. So, Rob, I don't know if in terms of your experience, in terms of, because for me this is a fundamental approach that we need to look at.
Absolutely, and I think there is a tendency for employers and even those in the education sector to want or hope or wish for a sort of list of reasonable adjustments that they can handily pick from, and it just doesn't work like that. I mean, Bill's given a very good example of a reasonable adjustment, which I hadn't, I wouldn't have thought of, but that came from conversation with the parent, presumably the child and those in education as well, to get to that very personalised adaptation that was made for that child. I think one of the dynamics with education is that we here in Scotland have an inclusive education, i.e. mainstream by default, and I think that's a very laudable ambition and position. But in order for that to create an inclusive education system, you need specialism within education. And over the last 15 years, we have seen a 20% decrease in the number of specialist teachers and specialist teaching assistants. So therefore, when it comes to the question of reasonable adjustments, you're seeing specialism come out of the system, and then the reliance on those making those reasonable adjustments on teachers that they themselves are not specialists, and so don't always have the training or awareness. So I think absolutely to move us to a true inclusive education system which makes reasonable adjustments proactively, we need to ensure that the specialism is there within the system.
Thanks, Camina.
Okay, thank you. Now questions from Marie McNair, please.
Thank you, Camina, and thanks for everything you do and being the voice for those who are neurodivergent. The committee heard in our lived experience session about the importance of autistic-led training so that people working across different sectors can react to the needs of neurodivergent people. Donnie, you spoke kind of briefly about training, and then obviously you spoke about the need for it to be much more than the 1 hour training. What's your thoughts on what is required and how it should be delivered?
I certainly don't, as I've already said, subscribe to kind of, here's a 1 hour online session. It needs to be reflective learning, and that's what a lot of our learning is about. It's, it's about giving the information, what is autism, neurodevelopmental condition, and all the practical things that go with that, but it's also goes into sort of, what sensory needs can be, and they aren't, that's not across the piece. They're very individual, but really getting underneath it in terms of, what you can change in terms of your own behaviour, getting an understanding, and the woman May from the Children's Tribunal this morning, I thought articulated it really well. We tend to home in on the behaviour and correcting the behaviour rather than understanding that dysregulation and distress can cause that behaviour. And if you address the dysregulation and the address, and actually that behaviour doesn't manifest itself. But you're not, as I say, you're not going to get to that position in a 1 hour session. That has to be a course. And when it comes to education, it is a very cursory part of teacher training. I would say it almost needs to go further as well, that head teachers need to lead the whole school, not just the qualifications that people achieve. And I know that there were initiatives planned for deputy head teachers to have neurodivergence training in an experiential way, so they maybe come into specialist schools for a period of time and can take that learning back out. So I'm probably not articulating this very well, but
it's been really helpful.
Yeah, but it needs to be almost something you have to do, not something you either choose to do or is a bit of a bolt-on.
Yeah, and be person-centred as well.
Absolutely, and co-produced is the way to do it, because we heard this morning and we've heard here that people's lived experience is really powerful. They know what works for them.
Anybody else get any kind of views on, how training should be delivered? Should it be, by those who have lived experience? And I definitely agree it should be, but yourself?
Absolutely, and I think Dorie's hit it on the head. I have a bit of a thing about training and learning because they are different.
Yep.
And I think learning is so important. It's what you do with that learning and how you're supported to put it into practice. And I think too often we have an hour tick box that says, I've done my autism awareness training. Nobody ever goes back with support and supervision to find out how you've put that into practice or what the barriers are. And I think we need to do that whole journey, you know, look at the that hierarchy, you know, of how do you actually know you've made a difference, and it's what you do in practice. We work. We have lots and lots of students on placement, and we make sure that the families and the person with profound learning disability are the experts. Profound means deep, wise, and expert, and they really do teach the students. And we've had social work students, primary school students and allied health professions all together, and that has been the most fabulous way to get people to really think about what difference it makes, noticing each of their professional roles, but actually always reverting back to the family carers to take advice. We once had a medical student who asked me some fairly challenging questions, but at the end, he was a physio student, sorry, and by the end of it, he'd taken some medical research that talked about quality of life and when to give up with our group. But by the end of his placement, he said, if I just looked at all the very, very scientific evidence base and I didn't look at qualitative data, I would be making the wrong clinical decision. And that was because he worked with the people with lived experience themselves and with the families. So I think how we put learning into practice is absolutely essential. And just one other thing, I'm very passionate about what I learned from my younger kids. I think children often have the answers, and maybe we should be doing more in school. I mean, the environments that were shared in that paper that the kids came up with, maybe we should be asking them in schools about how we change culture and attitudes, because otherwise you're always playing catch up, trying to educate the next generation when they're already in the workplace. You know, let's start a lot earlier.
You must be in my headspace. Exactly what I was going to say to you is, like, you know, how awareness is so important in breaking the stigma. Just watched recently Dinosaur, you know, the Ashley Story drama. I think it's too serious. It was really informative and very helpful, and I think we need more of that as well, you know. I think somebody else would like to come in. Yep.
I wanted to talk specifically about education just for a second, and I completely agree with everything Jenny just said, so I've not got very much to say. But I want to say that we at Stand have gave training to teachers. We do speech therapy workshops and things like this. I don't think the issue is always people not wanting to learn. These teachers are coming to us, they're paying for the training themselves. They are doing it in the evenings, they're doing it in their free time. So a lot of the time teachers actually want to learn. And we've been invited to speak to health visitors to give training, leisure centres. You know, it's not just teachers, it's people do want to know, but but the issue is it takes a very small amount to not want to know for it to have a huge impact on a child's life. You know, my oldest son attends a specialist provision, and I'll try to be very quick here, but his teacher is incredible, but she trained in Poland, and in Poland you have to do a whole separate degree, postgraduate qualification to work with children with specialist needs, complex needs, and the difference I see is tangible. You know, we feel supported, we feel listened to. She takes our advice. You know, yes, we have the CPMs, but she also has informal chats with us, communicates every day. You know, she just gets it. You know, she doesn't tell us. She wants to learn from us as his parents. He's non-speaking, so he can't really go down that route of, you know, telling her. But because he's not got a voice, we're his voice, and she's very receptive to that. And we've not really had that when he was in mainstream, unless we've had the luck of a good PSA at that point or something else. But back to the kind of point about the training, it's great, and I think that is I'm not saying every teacher needs a master's degree, that's a long way away, but I do think it needs to be mandatory. I completely agree with that. It needs to be mandatory, it needs to be neurodivergent led, or, you know, it needs to include whether it be the children, the parents, you know, neurodivergent people in some aspect. I do love doing our training at Stand for the teachers, parents. It's great, but sometimes I think grassroots organisations shouldn't be filling this gap. It should be provided. You know, even things like if we're going criminal justice, which we don't really work with, we've gave the police, Police Scotland and our local authority communication aids and lanyards, and you know we're actually giving them training, and they've never. They're like, this is great even for kids that speak a different language to be able to use visuals, and it goes so. Sorry, I've stopped all day, but you know where I'm getting.
Yeah, and if you get anything else you want to kind of update the committee on, please feel free to put a written submission into us. It'd be really helpful to our evidence session as well. Oh, sorry.
But it's to build on something that Doris said, which was what often makes the biggest difference is the management of the school and whether they're truly inclusive. And so it's about culture as much as anything else. So when I was head of a specialist school, if a child had a meltdown in school, it was our fault. And I don't mean we caused it necessarily, but we didn't take the steps to prevent it happening. And so I didn't get the pressure from staff to say, you've got to exclude this child, you've got to punish this child. There was an acceptance that if a child had a meltdown in the classroom, something had gone wrong during the school day, or something hadn't gone right during the school day, let's put it that way. And that, I think that's really, really important. And I suppose it links in with other policy areas, including school exclusions and attendance and whatever. But in my experience, working with different local authorities, different schools, everything depends on the management of the school in terms of culture.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's us. Yep.
We now have another question from Pam Gossel, please.
Thank you, Convener. There's often a postcode lottery in many areas when it comes to providing support for neurodivergent people, whether it comes to education, employment and the criminal justice system, which we heard from witnesses today. A big divide would be urban versus rural areas, but where else do you see regional differences in the support for neurodivergent people, and what do you think creates these differences?
Happy to go. One of the reasons that we are very supportive of the Learning Disability, Autism and Neurodivergence Bill is that there are a number of things in there which address the inconsistency in terms of support. Not least, there's the proposal around national and local strategies on a statutory footing, which would compel national and local government to look at the population that they have and plan support effectively for them, whether that is in education, care, and so on. And so I think for us, that is one of the ways to really make a difference on this, because there is a lot of inconsistency across the country in terms of diagnosis. In some parts of the country, you might be waiting a matter of months, in others, a matter of years. So there's inconsistencies there. There's challenges around support, as you say, particularly in rural locations as well, where people might be particularly isolated. So there's all of these kind of inconsistencies, and for us, the bill, which takes a whole system-wide approach, it's an attempt. The proposals there are to try and move us from the different siloed ways of working to bring things together, to plan effectively across all of these different agencies. I think there are also some very strong proposals in there around the criminal justice system in particular, around the identification of need at key points in the criminal justice system, so whether that is arrest, sentencing, entry to prison, etc., etc. So I think there's a range of things in the bill that would be helpful. While it won't eradicate inconsistency and create a perfect utopia immediately, I think it will lay the foundations for us to get us to a much better place.
Is there anybody else who wants to come in?
To say that totally agree with that, and we wholeheartedly support the LDAN bill. it's not really about geography, but one of the things I heard this morning was about the great work that's being done in the prison service and that. But one of the things that was really strange for us was we worked with Barlini to support the fathers of neurodivergent children, and in turn learned that some of those fathers themselves identified as neurodivergent. But actually, you have something really good happening in one prison, and everybody says that's great, but every prison is a small, autonomous entity. So it's if the governor supports that you're going to be able to deliver it somewhere else. So how you kind of, that's not even geography, that would be within similar cities or within similar locations. But that's a real barrier.
I think there's...
And there'll be other institutions like that.
So if you look at the prevalent rates of ADHD across Scotland and prescribing, you'll find that certain areas of Scotland they're all underperforming in terms, but there are some that are much, much better than others. And when you look as to what and try and explain that, you often find it's a single clinician who's led a team in that area, but has then moved on. And so we talk about this postcode lottery, but it's not a static postcode lottery. It goes up and down according to where individual people are. So, so much depends upon someone the leadership, someone taking the lead, leading a team, developing team skills, therefore being able to provide a service, and then they retire or they move abroad, as has happened in Fife and in Tayside, and then you lose that, and it goes down very, very quickly.
Thank you. And I think it's that bit about that sharing of knowledge. And I think, again, the Eldan Bill brought us all together with our collective knowledge to think about, well, what does work? And there's sometimes, it feels like an arrogance that because you're doing it in one area, you're not going to do it in another. And I think that, echoes what you're saying about the prisons, but also for the schools. You don't just have 32 different versions. You've then got the umpteen hundreds of schools in each area. So it's really building on what is working. I think what's really what was really gratifying here is that also there are groups within groups, and our community is often excluded or, they don't fit in anywhere. But you as a committee invited people with profound learning disabilities to be part of this discussion. And quite often they're not, they're a group within learning disabilities, but they're a group within neurodiversion. So I think that ability to actually look and include everyone, which again was what the Eldan Bill was doing, was actually placing an emphasis on every individual, because every individual is very different, but I think, we learn from each other.
Can I come back in again? Rob, I just want to come back to, obviously, your response. I know you mentioned the criminal justice side as well. I don't know if you're listening earlier on that I asked the question in relation to data collection, how important it is, whether that be in education, employment or criminal justice. My question was around, obviously, the domestic abuse data that Police Scotland collect, and there was an area that, there's a few areas, obviously, that are missing, but the one I spoke about was the disability side. So, my belief is, after speaking to so many organisations, so many victims, the thing is that if you're not collecting the right data and somebody has a disability or a support need, then how can you provide that? It can't be another kind of postcode lottery that are people falling down the gap and, things are passed on and nobody knows that that person needs that support. So I wanted to ask your view on that how important is data collection from the beginning?
I think it's really, really important. And the reality, if we take criminal justice, for example, there is a real inconsistency of data about the population, and we know that it's either a very the prison population, so even broader within the criminal justice system, that there is a significant minority of people that have that are neurodivergent, if not the majority, and that's how broad, wide the inconsistency is in terms of data. So there are some specific proposals within the Eldan Bill around data collection, which I think are very important in terms of identifying, and it's not sort of diagnosing people within the criminal justice system, but it's identifying need. But I think your next, where you were going with your question as well, was around also this data being more widely available for the public and policymakers. And, you know, if we go back to diagnosis again, where south of the border data is collected, disaggregated and published quarterly in terms of those waiting for a diagnosis, the gender, age, locations of those population, we have a clear idea about the scale. That data is not routinely published in Scotland, which poses a challenge if we're going to you know, do very, you know, and the Scottish Government has committed additional funding in terms of diagnosis. So how are we going to know that these different innovations and things like that are actually working or not working if the data isn't publicly available? So yes, I think it is very important. There's quite a lot about data within the proposed LDAN bill. I don't think it quite goes far enough because there's a lot in terms of criminal justice. But there is, as I say, this kind of data need in terms of diagnosis, but also in education as well. We count data in terms of prevalence in education, but we don't, for example, publish data. Something that we feel very strongly about is around exclusions and informal exclusions. So one of the things that we find, for example, is that autistic children and young people are not formally excluded from school, but they are on part-time timetables, or they are sitting out particular classes that don't work for them or aren't perceived as working for them. So I think that's an area where we want to see more data as well.
And how can you plan services if you don't have
Yes.
data? You know, and it's a bit of a conspiracy theory, isn't it? Well, let's not say how many people we have, so therefore we can't prove we need all these speech and language therapists. But, I mean, we're part of the Scottish COVID inquiry, and the big ask there is, where was the data for our group? Because they were not given the shielding letters, not given the right support. So I think data is absolutely essential, but we need to understand the groups within the groups again so that we can plan. We can plan for the future, but we can't do workforce development without that absolute accurate data.
I've just got one more following question. You know, earlier on, we spoke about, I spoke about postcode lottery and the regional differences between rural and urban. I wanted to touch on diverse communities, because much earlier on in our evidence sessions, we had a lady in and, you know, she spoke about being from a BAME background, and obviously coming from a BAME background myself, I'm aware, obviously I know people that have autism, but sometimes it's very hard for families, and I'm sure it could happen all over, not just BAME backgrounds, to accept there is an issue or there is a need for support or help. And it's just asking around that, do you have any sort of data or information that how you would work around that? Because that could end up a postcode lottery, because how people from some BAME backgrounds might be basically spoken to or asked certain questions have to be culturally sensitive from somebody else. So how do you work around that? And do you see there is postcode lotteries and differences there as well?
Well, I think there's absolutely the case that autistic people from black and minority ethnic backgrounds are not accessing services to the same degree as other cohorts within the population. National Autistic Society, we published a report. It's a few years ago now that we published it, but I'll share it with the committee for information. Interestingly, through the Autistic Adult Support Fund, which is run by Inspiring Scotland, there's some work going on at the moment about how we might make pre- and post-diagnostic support more inclusive in terms of ethnicity, because I think there's a recognition, looking at the data, that we are not adequately serving that population. So I think it's absolutely the case. And it comes back to your data point again. There really isn't the data out there about ethnicity when it comes to a lot of these matters. And we suspect that beyond that issue about people from particular backgrounds not engaging with services, there is also other cultural factors which we need to take into consideration, and how the awareness and understanding levels within different communities is quite variable. So we need to understand that more as well, and if there are barriers there.
No, it's interesting you say that, because ethnicity and disability are the two things I brought up in my bill data collection around that. So it's so important that we know firsthand what's happening, and then you can basically have the services. And you're right, Jenny, how can you end up having services in place if you don't know what the data is? So yeah, no, thank you. This has been really helpful. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. On that point, the committee has heard that neurodivergent people are some of the most discriminated against groups in Scotland. And of course, that is compounded by intersectional qualities of an individual, whether that's from a BAME background, being a woman, those types of things. What are your views on that in terms of that statement? Tim, would you like to come in, Bill?
An intentional discrimination or an unintentional discrimination. I think there are still, I think coming from certain geographical locations, I've often been told that a young lad has the difficulties he has because he comes from the scheme, and as if coming from a particular type of housing causes autism or ADHD. And it is true that you will tend to get an overrepresentation of neurodivergent populations in areas of high social housing, for example. But it's this confusion in causation, and we go back to the diagnostic overshadowing that we were talking about earlier, that there are still prejudices there, and there's a low level. I think it can be teachers who might have quite a middle-class, middle-income approach and think that certain parental lifestyles or certain family backgrounds are suboptimal in some way. And I do see this, I see this as being an issue, particularly, for example, when social work assess the capacity of a parent to parent a child. A lot of prejudices can come into that process. So I don't think it's just about BAME, and I don't think it's about English as a second language. I think it goes really deeper into society. We may think that we have, to a large extent, reduce the class system as it used to be maybe 30, 40 years ago, but I think there are still those prejudices there, and I would fully support that sentiment.
Thank you. Just going back, I think, Danny, it was yourself that had raised, I think this is part of the first question, in terms of barriers to diagnosis. Do you think this is one of those issues where there maybe is a prejudice, a misunderstanding, particularly for girls as well?
Yes. We're trying not to speak all day, because obviously I'm a female and I'm diagnosed ADHD, and I was overlooked. I think girls, women, mask also, as Bill said, we see boys sometimes can fit that stereotype, but then also what we see is a diagnosis of other things could be missed because they're automatically assumed to be ADHD, and it might be that they need a multidisciplinary assessment, and there might be other things going on too. We'd wrote things about the ethnic minorities, and the system right now is built around a narrow, stereotyped understanding of neurodivergent conditions and what they look like. Anyone who doesn't fit that template has to work harder to be recognised, believed and supported, and the assumptions aren't just social, they become embedded in institutional language, professional expectations, inspection culture. When frameworks emphasise compliance, as in eye contact, we see this in inspections report from Education Scotland. They'll actually praise children for good eye contact, and that goes against NAIT guidance. But this is just last year. We've seen a lot of quotes that I'm happy to send out, and this is then what teachers are. It's really difficult for them to then make reasonable adjustments or anything else we spoke about and see these things if they're then being graded on things that are seen as compliance or masking. If we're serious about equality, reform can't stop at pathways, strategies, waiting lists. We need to examine the attitude reflected in the policy, training, inspection. These attitudes shape whose distress is understood and who is framed as defiance. Until it changes, outcomes will continue to be determined by perception long before assessment, diagnosis, or even support is given, really. Right now it's about, we're masking, that's great. rather than the whole story.
So you'd say that, do you think the prejudice, and I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth here, so I'm being careful just how I word the questions, but oftentimes with some of the evidence that we've heard back, there's that misunderstanding to how neurodivergence presents, and it doesn't, if it's not conforming to a way in which the school day should go, the school day should be run, then that is something that's maybe picked up. It's not until there's a disruptor in that day that is then maybe pulled out. But if the child is struggling without a disruptor, that's not so picked up. Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. Dory, you had indicated.
Yeah, I would agree completely with what Danny was saying. What I'll do is I'll share some of our advice line and community services statistics with you. So a thing that I'm taking back is getting that around BAME, if we've got that data and can share that as well, because virtually every call is going to be about some form of discrimination against an autistic person. So I'll send that on to you.
That would be really helpful. Thank you, Rob.
Just build on what people are saying, which I completely agree with the statement that this is a group that does face significant discrimination within our time, and I think the results of people not getting support can be catastrophic in some cases, and we're talking about people who not getting that support, that can lead to a mental health crisis. They can then find themselves within the criminal justice system or being detained under mental health legislation, then within mental health institutions. And once you're in a mental health institution, that is a very challenging environment for an autistic person to be in, and the risk of just living in that institution for many years. So I think the sum total can be absolutely catastrophic for individuals and their families. I think just to say as well, in terms of the attitudinal points, we are at quite a pivotal point, I think, now in the kind of national debate and national discussion around autism and neurodivergence. There are a range of very unhelpful narratives out there, some of them within this country, some of them from politicians, some of them from politicians across in America, for example, which are taking where we got to was a heightened awareness about autism to now lots of misunderstandings and myths and assumptions and mistruths out there. So, and one of those dangerous narratives is that lots of people are getting overdiagnosed. This is all a bit nonsense. We need to stop this. And that is hugely damaging. I think, it's incumbent on us as third sector organisations, but also politicians of all parties and the government to keep the debate very much focused on the evidence and truth. And I think that's really important. That's something that autistic people and families are continually talking to us about, their worries, their concerns, their anxieties about the different narratives out there.
Thank you for that, Rob. And just before we finish up there, I'd like to just hear from you what we've looked at it maybe through quite a negative lens as well, because there is a lot wrong for neurodivergent people at the moment. When we get this right, when a school gets it right, when the health authority gets it right, when a neurodivergent child, young person in adulthood has the support mechanisms in place, or a neurodivergent friendly upbringing and experience, what difference does that make? Not just for the individual, but for society as a whole. What is the selling point of getting this right for neurodivergent people? Bill?
With ADHD, and again, I hesitate to generalise, but there are certain qualities there, the thinking outside the box, the entrepreneurial side of things, the breaking down their own personal barriers. I know a lot of people with ADHD who are very, very successful. And in fact, one of the debates that we ought to have is, instead of focusing on those who have very poor life outcomes, which is about 80% perhaps, is to take a look at the 20% and then say why. Why did these people who face such adversity in utero, effectively, go on to have quite successful lives? And look at all the different components, which will include education, it will include the family background and having trusted adults. It'll be about opportunities. It'll be about their own personal choices as well. But I'm very, very positive. I think what we've got out there is currently defined as a huge area of complex need that politicians and decision makers are struggling with. But actually, on a personal level, through my life and work in this area, I see so many success stories. And, you know, I wish I could synthesise all those success stories and come up with a blueprint and say, if you did this for every child, they also would have good outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dori. Sorry, Dori, then
Do you want to go
Jenny.
around the table?
Yes, I agree with you. I'm going to give one example, and I don't think she'll mind. It's a colleague of mine who is autistic and had a very poor experience at school and at university. She then went on to another university and had a very, very good and rewarding experience. She now works with us on our voice and participation, so making sure we hear the voices of all the people that we support. I hope she's happy. She'll be better able to tell you that herself. But from our perspective, she's inspiring. She's motivating, she's a can-do person, and probably, you know, one of the best colleagues that I work with. And that really says it all. You know, get it right at the start, then you can get it right later on, and that person can really reward society.
And so if you get it right for the most complex people, you get it right for everybody. And playing on that word profound, meaning deep, wise and expert, and looking at it really positively. I mean, it is right. And the families that we work with come up with the most inspiring and creative solutions to some of the trickiest issues that we have. But when you do get it right, you know, you build a community that listens with all its senses and is able to include everybody.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay. Any more feedback? Okay. Rob.
And I think, yeah, sometimes we can get into the area of just thinking about all the negatives and how to fix those rather than flipping it. And I think, you know, less than a third of autistic people are in employment. So that is a huge untapped resource of innovators, problem solvers, and often the reality is that if you're autistic, you have to innovate and think outside the box, or you've overcome challenges and barriers that you're facing in your life. So there's a certain resilience that comes with that. There's sort of innovation that comes with that. So I think there's an untapped wealth of resource there. About a third of my staff team here in Scotland are autistic, and so as you would expect us to do, we think a lot about our processes, procedures, environment, physical environment, sensory environment, all of those things, the sum total of which makes for a very good place to work, both for autistic people and non-autistic people as well. And as Jenny says, you get it right for those with the most complex needs, you get it right for everybody.
Thank you. Danny, did you want to come in?
Very quickly, I was agree with everything Rob said as well, but obviously we've not been around that long, like new. So the best thing we've seen about getting it right is the environment, like you said. Our events, we've seen kids walk in the door on day one and be terrified, not want to come into the hallway, and within a few weeks, they're running about having the time of their life, and it's just having that environment where they're not judged, their parents are relaxed because the fire exits are manned, so the kids aren't going to escape. And after a few weeks, you really see that personality, and they're getting that right to thrive that we all want them to get.
Yeah, absolutely. A great note to end on. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning. That concludes our formal business in public, and thank you again for your attendance. We will now move into private session to discuss the remaining item on our agenda. Thank you.